Hello, good morning, everybody. Welcome back. Today is our last day of the school. You are very strong to be here on the last day. Thank you very much. Now you have a talk of Professor Sérgio Muniz. You'll be our first speaker for today. Sérgio graduated in the University of São Paulo, USP. During his doctorate, he worked with Professor Eric Cornell and Carl Wyman at the University of Colorado in Boulder. He did his postdoc at Georgia Institute of Technology, Georgia Tech, and at NIST in the United States. Have a joint position at the Joint Quantum Institute at the University of Maryland, working in the group of Professor William Phillips. He is currently a professor at the University of São Paulo, here in the Physics Institute of São Carlos. His research interests are in the area of optics, atomic physics, ultra-cold gases and quantum matter, and in quantum technology, nitrogen vacancy centers in diamonds and optical teasers. Thank you very much, Sergio, for accepting our invitation, and please, I think you can start now.
Thank you, Monica, and let me first start also saying big thanks to the organizers, all of you. It's a great pleasure to be here in this school, this nice school. And so I will present to you today work that has been developed in the last few years. It's really a collaborative effort between theory and experiment. And let's just see if it's working here. Let me put the pointer so everybody can see, even the people online. Okay. So here, the work has a contribution also from my colleagues here, Professor Frederico Brito and Gustavo Teles, that you heard from the school here, and also has a collaboration with Sebastian Defner, Professor Sebastian Defner from the University of Maryland in Baltimore County. And since this is a school, I think it's appropriate to give you a little bit of context about the work. So just as many of the previous talks, what I'm going to talk about today is very broad, and the time I have is not enough to cover everything. So I think it's appropriate to give you an overview of what this field of stochastic thermodynamics, and particularly quantum stochastic thermodynamics, is all about. And so let me just start saying right in the beginning what is the main message that I want to tell you today. So this is in this first slide here. So the main point, the main part of the presentation will be discussing what I believe is a new perspective on it might be a new perspective on the treatment of non-equilibrium thermodynamics for quantum fluids in general. It's based on these methods from stochastic thermodynamics. We're going to introduce to you today an accessible quantifier for entropy production and a new fluctuation theorem for BECs, and also present some first and preliminary seal experimental verification from these ideas. And in the process, as a bonus, we'll have to discuss a little bit about this concept of absolute irreversibility, and also present some first evidences for the experimental realization of this in open quantum systems. So this is the, say, technical part of the talk, and this is the main message I want you to get. So this is the upshot from the talk. But so here's the outline. But before, I'm going to give you a little bit of context and the motivation for these studies in general, and introduce a little bit of the concept of fluctuation theorems in general. And then I'll talk about how we propose this form of theorems for quantum gases, for BECs in particular, and the results from the experiments, and the discussions about this concept of absolute irreversibility, and the conclusions and perspectives in the field. So let's start with a little bit of context. And of course, this is in the framework of thermodynamics. So if we were to see a little short history about thermodynamics, we all know that it starts with heat engines. But if you see the discussions about thermodynamics in more present time, it's still relevant, and actually this is the main point that we're trying to discuss and address here, at least in part, using now these quantum fluids, is for small systems. So the thermodynamics of very small systems, including molecules, single atoms even, and there's a whole field, very interesting field on molecular motors, and also if you include concepts of using information to extract work, like in a Maxwell-Demons way, you also have the discussions and the possibilities to think about engines, machines that extract work from information. So this is a general topic, which I'm not going to be addressing today, but let me first just put some clear definitions here. When I say thermodynamics, nano-thermodynamics, I mean thermodynamics for very small systems. Can go down to the level of a single quantum system. So, and then the sense of quantum thermodynamics is the bigger goal of trying to merge these two very different theories together and make sense of the meaning of thermodynamics for a single system. As we all know, thermodynamics is something that is defined for a macroscopic system. In the thermodynamic limit, we have, very, very large number of systems. So what does it mean for a single atom or molecule to talk about thermodynamics? So what does it change, and what does it really mean, how we deal with that? So let's first start from the beginning, and from what we all learn in the introductory courses in physics. So you all have heard about thermal engines, yeah? And then you have some sort of device here in the middle that is connected, in this case, for instance, to two thermal reservoirs at the TH, meaning the higher temperature, T hot and T cold. And you can run this engine, a thermal engine is one that extracts heat or energy, flow of energy from the hot reservoir, produce some amount of work, and still reject some remaining energy or flux of energy, heat, to the lower temperature reservoir. So the prototypical example is the Carnot cycle, and the efficiency for a Carnot engine, which is a reversible engine, is the ratio of the amount of work that you can extract here divided by the amount of energy extracted from the heat source. So this can be expressed, at least for the Carnot case, as 1 over the temperatures from the cold over the hot temperature, and which means that it's always smaller than 1, the efficiency. So this is all well known, but here I'm writing the statements for the first and the second law in a slightly different form. I'm gonna, since for the students, I suggest you to see this video from Professor Gabriel Landi on YouTube later. The video is actually about something different, but in the first part of the video, he gives a very, very pedagogical discussions about this subject, and I like that very much, so I'm borrowing here part of his arguments. And I'm expressing, though, the first law, the balance of energy, in terms of change, rates of variations. So in other words, I'm interested in seeing how the internal energy of the system changes. And so this is all expressed in terms of rates. The dots here represent derivatives with respect to time. So the first law basically says that the change of the internal energy of the system depends on the flow of heat from the reservoirs from and to the lower temperature one, and the rate that the work is produced, the power. The second law has to do with entropy, And basically, what the second law does, it imposes some conditions or restrictions for the first law. So not all the process that obeys the first law are realizable. For instance, I cannot take all the heat from the hot source and transform into work. So normally the second law is expressed in terms of what is forbidden or in terms of inequalities like it's written here. But if you look into the second law in terms of rate or of change of the entropy, you will have that a new term now, if the system is driven at any given rate, meaning by that that is not a quasi-static process, then this extra entropy, so the entropy, the bottom line is the entropy is not, there's not a conservation law for entropy. So you can, depending how you do the process, if you do it very slowly or if you do fast, you can actually generate entropy in the process, and this generated entropy is called entropy production, which I'm representing here by this sigma. Sigma, this is the rate of entropy production. And these terms here are the usual Clausius terms that you would have from the definition from the entropy. So in this way, the second law can be simply stated in terms of this entropy production as it being a positive quantity. It will only be equal to 0 when you have a reversible process. So in a way, the entropy production is a measure of the irreversibility of your process. So why does it matter? So if you just take an example, for instance, consider a stationary state, meaning that these derivatives here are 0. It doesn't mean that nothing happens, just that you have the balance. So you can be producing work, extracting heat from the hot source, and so on. But you do in such a way that these first and the second laws are equal to 0. And then you substitute in the Carnot expression, you will end up with this expression, general expression here in the last part. And the meaning here is, so if you do the process, it's actually a very simple exercise. You can do it later. You have these first two terms, which is basically just the first two terms from the Carnot expression. So these are the Carnot efficiency. But you have this other term, which is strictly negative, because the entropy production is positive, right? And that means that the efficiency, when you do the process in a non-quasi-static or a very slow diabatic process, so if you do it at any given rate, and in particular if you do it very fast, you produce, due to the presence of this term here, due to the entropy production, the efficiency of the process will be lower. So that's basically what forbids you from reaching the Carnot bound. So I think this is a nice way of introducing this concept of entropy production, and as you will see later, it's relevant for the discussion that I'm going to present here today. As I mentioned before, a lot of interest in studying these ideas for very small systems, and particularly in the mesoscale. By that I mean at energy scales that are in the order of kBT, on the energy, the environmental, the fluctuations around the temperature that the system has, at a given environment. And if you look for the systems in nature that has the highest classical Carnot efficiency, you find that very often it's some biological system. Probably due to the evolution and the specification, these systems, these micro engines, let's say, these microscopic or molecular engines are, it's proper to call them engines because you can establish something very similar to what I described. In particular for these cases here, let me see, maybe this just start again. This here is a very well-known structure called ATP synthase, and it's very important in the process to produce ATP in the cell. It's very well known and studied, particularly in this field of stochastic thermodynamics. And as you see here, if I change the pointer, anyway, I just want to restart the video here. But the point that I want to make here is that there are this, nature, there is these molecules and very small structure, proteins and so on, that behaves as machines. And this one here is also a well-known case called kinesin, which is a motor protein. And these videos here, of course, are simulations, just animations, but they are based on actually experimental data. And here this shows that this rotor, as it produces and uses energy from ATP. So this is a process that happens all inside of all of our cells. And this motor protein actually transport structures inside of the cell. So it actually has this kind of behavior where this protein actually sort of walks in these structures called microtubules. I don't have time to discuss this in detail, so I put here some links for you if you never heard about this before. But this, you can actually apply thermodynamics for this system, in particular if you use these stochastic treatments. And naturally, you can ask now, what about quantum? Can I still think about these things when I go to a single molecule? I mean, a small molecule. Those molecules that I mentioned before are very large, and they are, for all practical purposes, classical. I mean, they are in an environment with a lot of fluctuations at room temperature and so on. And the answer, again, is yes. There are actually several examples about that. I just picked one here that's relatively recent, where there is experimental demonstrations of some predictions that a quantum heat engine, I mean the quantum version of a heat engine, can actually have advantage of a classical one. And so this actually is an experiment using these nitrogen vacancy centers in diamonds. And they actually show that such a kind of quantum engine can actually produce more power than any equivalent classical heat engine operating under the same conditions, the same sort of resources. I just point out here because this nitrogen vacancy centers is a system that actually we study in our lab as well, but I don't have time to talk about them today. So, how do we understand this kind of very small system, these nanothermodynamics or quantum thermodynamics systems? How I go about dealing with them, describing them? Certainly, it's not the way that we're used to in the standard thermodynamics, which is for macroscopic system and talks about equilibrium. These small systems, fluctuations are very important. I mean, they're essential. So how do you deal with that? The answer is, or at least has been in the last couple of decades or so, there's been a lot of progress in this field called stochastic thermodynamics. And it turns out that this is a very good option to describe such systems. And there's a lot of interest in a very vibrant community, lots of interesting results happening there. This is, in a very concise description, we can say that is an emergent field from the statistical mechanics that provides, for what matters to us here, a well-developed framework to understand this non-equilibrium dynamics. Basically, what it does, it considers how you would go about defining work and heat exchanges for stochastic trajectories for describing this system. So in the end, you will use, basically, oversimplification, of course, but you will use stochastic variables to describe these quantities now, instead of the usual way that you would normally do in statistical mechanics. And so you will talk about microscopic trajectories for a given particle, for instance, and tabulating, calculating the work that you do at every step. Just to give you an example, if you've seen Talita's poster in this school, she presents a protocol where we actually measure the position of a colloidal particle in a solution trapped in an optical trap, and where you can actually define these quantities, work and heat, at every step, when we can actually measure that with very high resolution. And then basically for every trajectory, you will have a different different results. So if you say move a particle from here to here, because it's subject to fluctuations to Brownian motion, for instance, every trajectory will be different. And so you will have a value for work, and the mean work, the average work, you calculate from those trajectories. So this is basically the framework where you would go about using stochastic thermodynamics in general. So there are several tools in the stochastic thermodynamics toolbox, and I definitely don't have time to talk about all of them, so I will focus here on fluctuation theorems, which are relevant for our discussion here today. But again, since this is a school, I put here some references which I think might be useful for you to learn more about that. In particular, this one here, I think is very pedagogical. It's a review article, and you can access it from the archives. This review of modern physics, you also will find the archives. I just don't have the reference here right now, but I can find, if you have trouble, to find the articles later. But I believe you will not have a problem finding it here while you are here at the university. But anyway, so let me talk a little bit about these fluctuation terms in general. The history of this system is actually not too long. This field is relatively new, but you will see discussions about fluctuation theorems maybe starting from the late 70s or beginning of the 80s. Definitely in the 90s, there are some very interesting results that appeared. But the result that actually galvanized, let's say, the field and called a lot of attention was a result derived by Chris Jarzynski, also from the University of Maryland, at least now. At the time, he was at Los Alamos, if I'm not mistaken. This is the first paper. There's actually a sequence of paper I just put here because the physical review letters consider this one of the milestones results. So I just want to show you that. The paper is actually very interesting. I suggest you to read. It's very simple to read, actually. Very unusual for our standards of papers, but the results are very profound. And basically, it derives a relation, which I states here. I'm actually just clipping from the paper. It basically mentions that if you consider a process where, say, you're doing work in some system, general system, and say stretching a rubber band, for instance, or even a coil, but possibly stretching this coil, the spring, to maybe even to the limit that it goes beyond the elastic regime. In any case, it's quite general, the argument anyway. If you do it very slowly, let's say if you have a spring and you pull that very slowly, meaning that you do that quasi-statically using thermodynamics, you will have that the average work that you do, if you consider a macroscopic system, then you will get what you would expect from usual thermodynamics. But if you try to do that for a molecule, for say, and I'm going to show you an experiment about that just in a minute, and this molecule is subjected to these fluctuations, for example. What you see, and you calculated this average work, just like I described for the experiment from Talita, you will see that if you do that very slowly, the work that you do equals to the internal energy of the system, the free energy of the system. In this case, it will be equal to the Helmholtz free energy, meaning that you're converting reversibly all the internal energy of the system into work. But if you do that very fast, out of equilibrium, then you pay a price for that because you generate entropy, and it means that your average work, the work that you will do now to change the system, will be larger. Basically, that's the essence what this statement says. This is well known. This is basically it's another way of thinking about the second law. What Jarzynski showed in his paper, and again, I think his paper is very interesting because this result is really in the introduction of the paper, like in the first few paragraphs. He actually states this is the main result, and here it is. And it says that the average, the ensemble average of this exponential here, it is equal to this other side, what is remarkable here is that this quantity here is a stochastic one, meaning that this is a non-equilibrium quantity. And now you have this equals to a thermodynamic function, a state function, which is defined only in equilibrium. So in other words, if you invert that, you can extract, you can calculate some equilibrium quantity from experiments that are done out of equilibrium. So this is the relevance of this result. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. So here's the summary of what I've just said. I'm putting here a different notation just to be more familiar to the one that I'm going to show you later, okay? So this is basically the same thing, just written in different notation. He's using the bar here for the ensemble average. I'm using the bracket. Beta here is the usual definition of the 1 over kBT, or inverse temperature for short. And you can actually rewrite these expressions. It's a very simple exercise. Just rewrite that in this way, such a way that you will have here something exponential of some quantity. The average exponential of some quantity equals to 1. It may seem strange, but it's just some algebra here, and you will see soon why I'm putting in this form. But if you prefer, this is, again, the way that is presented in the paper. Here on the left side, you have the average of some stochastic quantity, something that can be driven out of equilibrium. So just to be clear, say that you're doing an experiment with a molecule. I'm going to show you an example just in a minute. And you're doing this, and you do very slowly, meaning in a reversible way, or you do it very fast, and you do it out of equilibrium. No matter what you do, and that's the point, no matter what you do, provided that the conditions for this theorem are granted, which basically means that you start from equilibrium. So the initial point, the start of the process has to be in equilibrium. But the following, the protocol after the beginning, it may not be in equilibrium. So you can do it very fast. So you can stretch it and do it very fast. Say, you do it here, and you stretch this very fast. And you change the rate. Doesn't matter. But in the beginning, you wait long enough, so you start from equilibrium. And you compute the work along this trajectory and repeat it many, many times to do this average. You can equate this thing here, which is a stochastic one, non-equilibrium quantity. The average of this will be equal to an equilibrium, a standard thermodynamic quantity. This is quite remarkable. Okay? So this is one striking consequence that I'm pointing out here. And one immediate application, particularly for the chemistry, is to determine these free energies. Here, for the chemistry, for the chemist, the Gibbs free energy is more useful than the Helmholtz one, but they're related, especially if you're doing, usually in chemical reactions, you do that under constant pressure. So both quantities are usually useful when you have also constant temperature, meaning that you have in contact with a single reservoir. So if you do that, you can actually extract these quantities, which are quite relevant in chemistry. For instance, if a reaction will be spontaneous or not, depends on this delta G, can be calculated or inferred or even simulated, can be obtained from simulation experiments that can be done under non-quasi-static conditions. Okay, so this is one of the applications. It's not the main one, but let me show you some of these evidence. I mean, this is, after all, a theory that actually had been very well studied. And right a few years after Czarsinski's paper, Carlos Bustamante group have shown these very remarkable experiments using a single molecule, RNA, actually. So here is a schematic of the paper. Here on the ends, here it's very small, I'm sorry for that. This part here represents the RNA molecule. You bind this molecule to both ends to some microspheres. One of them is held in an optical trap, so you can measure the force, and the other one is connected to a micropipette when you can actually connect a piezoelectric drive, so you can actually extend the molecule. in the end, what you do is you're actually stretching this RNA molecule. So it's in a convolved, it's in a conformation that normally it would be folded. So when you stretch it, it unfolds. If you do it slowly, here is the rate, 2 to 5 piconewtons per second is the rate that you're pulling it apart. It is reversible, meaning that the way you fold and unfold follow basically the same trajectory if you plot that the force versus displacement from both ends for the molecule. But if you do it fast, then you have some hysteresis in the process, meaning that you will have irreversibility showing up. So what they do in this experiment is actually to do that for very different rates, from the reversible branch here to very irreversible, meaning that you clearly see this hysteresis showing up. And no matter how you do that, if you use the Jarzynski relation, you should be able to recover the free energy from this molecule. And that's what they show. Here there's a lot of information. I will not have time to go into details, but the top one here basically shows the reversible stretching. And here is the average work. The bar here gives you the uncertainty for the experiment, which is basically tells you the range that you rely on the deviation when you do the comparison. Here, in this part here, is shown the reversible stretching. These points here show the prediction from the fluctuation dissipation theorem. That would be the other way, one of the methods that you could use to determine the value of the free energy. But after some range, you see, after you start to stretch far enough, the results start to deviate from the range that is expected, whereas the Jarzynski result, which is the dashed lines here, they all fall into the range that is expected. In other words, you can get reliable results for the free energy even doing this for irreversible processes. Here in the bottom, you see the results that you collect for the work distributions that for each of these different experiments. Here is another paper a few years later from the same group. And here they actually testing another fluctuation theorem, which is called Crookes fluctuation theorems or Crookes-Jarzynski fluctuation theorems, which basically tells you that the probabilities for the process forward, if you calculate the probability distributions, things like that here, you do this several times, do the experiments, and then do a histogram to see what is the distribution of values for the work that you get from the experiment. You see that the probabilities distributions for the forward process is different from the one for the same reverse process. So you do that, you stop in the end, let it equilibrate, and do it exactly the same process again. Because it's under fluctuations, it will be not exactly the same, so you will have a distribution. When you take the two distributions and divide, it has, again, a very precise formula, not any formula. So that means that the probability distributions for this process cannot be arbitrary. It has a symmetry. The process forward and backwards, the reversible process, has a symmetry that's given by the fluctuation theorem, in this case, Crookes fluctuation theorem. And here are the results for them. So because this here involves this exponential, if you take the logarithm from this ratio here, you have a straight line, a linear dependence, and that's what this plot shows. All right, so this is just to give you a little bit of perspective or context about these ideas. But here, I'm here to talk about BEC. So what about quantum? Do you have fluctuation theorems for quantum systems? And the answer again is yes. And this is the review paper that I mentioned to you before. Again, you can find all details you need there. I'm just going to summarize various part here that I actually, again, clipped from the paper just so because in case you want to see the paper later, you immediately find. Here, if you define the logarithm ratios of this forward and the time reversible processes, again, the inspiration here is the same here, right? So you have this ratio of these probabilities for the forward and the reverse process. It is usually related by some sort of exponential. So if you take the logarithm of that, that's what is described here, and you define this quantity here, provided that these probability distributions are properly normalized, this immediately follows a general relation of this type here for any quantity R. So this R here may represent different observables, and these probabilities are the probability distributions for such observable, okay? And this means that there are very different ways to formulate these fluctuation theorems, not only for work, the one from Jarzynski for work, but you formulate that in terms of entropy and heat and other quantities as you like. And these fluctuation theorems are quite general. And in this case here, in this context here, this notation here is written for the quantum system. So in this case, we will define and use the density operator, the density matrix for the system and so on. The bottom line is you can define fluctuation theorems for quantum system as well. And they have this general form here. They are quite general, but they're only useful if R is expressed in terms of physical and measurable quantities, right? So physics will be useful if it relates to something physical, and it's better be something that you can measure, otherwise it's not very useful. So you can see the reference for more details later, or we can talk later after the talk. So now we're in position to start to talk about these fluctuation terms for BEC. So what about BECs? Well, at this time from the school, you heard a lot about BECs already, and you know that they can be described by this Gross-Podolsky equation, which in a very simplistic way, you can think of that as a sort of a nonlinear Schrödinger equation, and this is due to the interaction for these atoms. Most of the experiments, and certainly the ones that I'm going to be describing here, have condensates at the order of 1 million atoms, or maybe a little less than 100,000 atoms or so. Here I'm taking the number of order 10 to the 5. And these have some nice properties. These probabilities are conserving. In many cases, you have unitary dynamics. This psi term here, it looks like a wave function. Technically, it's not quite a wave function. It's the order pattern for the many-body system. But you can think of that in a simple way as the wave function for your system, for your condensate. And more interesting, if you take the square of that, that gives you directly the density of the atoms in the trap. So what about defining fluctuation theorems or something like a Jarzynski equality for BECs? Well, there are some difficulties when you try to write something like the Jarzynski relation for the BECs. And part of that is because in the classical system, these quantities here, work, free energy, heat, are very well defined. You have no doubts about how to define such quantities for classical systems. Generally, in classical systems, you start from equilibrium. That's basically the only requirement that you have from the Jarzynski equation to apply that theorem. And as I mentioned in the experiments from Talita, you can actually do continuous measurement of the system, sometimes with very fast acquisition and so on. So you actually follow the trajectories and can relate it very well with the standard definitions from stochastic thermodynamics in terms of these trajectories. But for the quantum systems, this is a little more subtle. Quantities like work and heat are not very well defined in quantum mechanics. I mean, you can define them, but they depend on the model that you're using. So there's certainly no consensus on the proper way of defining such quantities. And part of that is because even in the classical system, they do depend on the trajectories and so on. The concept of trajectory just like in the classical system, the stochastic trajectory is also odd for quantum mechanics. We don't have really the concept of trajectory for a quantum system. Particularly for BECs, if you consider the GPE description for that, that basically describes a system that has 0 temperature. So it's kind of hard to look in compared to something like this. This is more of a technical term, this 2-point measurements, but basically means that in quantum mechanics, you will not be observing the system continuously. You will do 2 measurements in the end, in the beginning, and that's usually how you define such things. You say, like, what is the initial density matrix, and then what's the evolved density matrix, and you do some theory to describe the evolution of the density matrix, and so on and so forth, and then you calculate these quantities. And more importantly, for the ones of you, for those who work actually in the lab with BECs, like myself for many years, the experiment in BEC takes something on the order of a minute. It can be a little short, sometimes a little longer, which means that if you really have to do thousands and thousands of repetitions to build these statistics, this is very complicated. I mean, this easily can take months just for taking the data. Here in São Carlos, we've done several studies with thermodynamics of these quantum gases, and some of these experiments took several months just to take the data. So this is not a very practical process to apply these quantities. So then what would be a good observable for BECs? What would be the quantity that I'm going to put here in the exponential in this generalized form for these fluctuation theorems? Well, in quantum mechanics, we love probabilities, right? I mean, in fact, that's all we got in thermodynamics, right? In quantum mechanics. For BEC, as a natural choice is the square psi, right? Is the density. So we could go about building that, and so you can ask, so what can we do with the density? Well, how about defining this way? So if you define this quantity here, now my sigma, I'm defining the sigma that has the role of this entropy production as in this form. And this is done because it will rarely leave to the form that you can write fluctuation theorems for that. But the point here, these are directly accessible from the images, from the experiments. So you don't have to do thousands of repetitions. You take one image and you already have the distribution from the ensemble. So this is a very important point. Then if you do and follow the procedure, you get fluctuation theorems for this quantity. And this was derived by Sebastian Defner when he visited my lab a few years back, and we were discussing about the practical way of doing something similar for BECs. And so, summarizing, what's the ingredients for these fluctuation terms for BEC? Basically, it used this definition of this quantity that I'm going to call the entropy production, which is defined in terms of the density from the condensate, directly from the images. And it just involves a priori assumption that we have unitary dynamics. Basically, that the evolution is given by some sort of unitary. And then you can derive a relation from that. Let me describe quickly the experiment here. That's some image that you've probably seen several times now in this conference. It describes Gustavo's system in Vanderlei's lab. Some nice pictures from the experiment. And here we're going to be talking about a BEC from rubidium atoms. This is a view from the cell. This is the rubidium atoms in the magnetico-optical trap, the first stage of cooling. This is a different view. This is the whole setup, these nice images I got from Gustavo. So this is the left side here is the chamber that you produce, these cold atoms, the MOT, magnetico-optical trap. Then they transfer the atoms to the science cell, where they produce the BEC. This is produced in a magnetic trap after some manipulations of this trap. Basically, they use this configuration here with 3 coils called Ioffe configuration. And in the end, you have a harmonic potential with these parameters here. What is important here is that the average, the typical characteristic time for the atoms in this, the condensate in this trap is in the order of 5 milliseconds. This is the only thing that matters for now. So the experiment is more elaborate. I won't have time to describe it. These 3 coil configurations allow you go from this quadrupole configuration from these 2 coils here by running current in this small coil here, as you increase the current, you go from the quadrupole configuration to something that looks like a parabola, at least near the center here. And that's where you do the evaporation. You do evaporative cooling here. I took some nice images from Franco's thesis. That is a reference here. And here's some nice images also from the evaporation process that you probably have heard about during these last days. So in the end here, you're cooling the atoms. Here you have a thermal cloud. As you go through the BEC transition, you start to see this bimodal distribution. There's a sharp concentration of atoms in the center that corresponds to the condensate. And as you go further down with evaporation, you cool it further, and you get temperatures on the order of 100 nanokelvin or so. And with a number of atoms on the order of 10 to the 5, like I said, and condensate fractions that can be like 70% or larger, depends on the details of the experiment. All that doesn't matter for what I'm going to tell you about here. But this is a nice information in any case. Here are some experiments, and the experiment that I'm going to describe here is the simplest one possible. Why? Well, the first thing is the less mass you have in complications that you put in the experiment, the better. So what we're doing here is basically you got the experiment, the BEC after evaporation, and release it from the trap. We turn it off fast enough such that you basically have a diabatic turn off, and the atoms start to expand and fall under the gravity. So here you have the pictures for different time of flight, 2 milliseconds to 8 milliseconds, and you have the usual, let me show you an amplified version here, image that you get from the BEC. Since this one is more compressed in the vertical direction here, as it expands, it will expand faster in this direction due to the mean field. All right, so this is very different from the classical cloud, which I'm showing here. Here, I just want to point out that these images here actually give you the distribution, the psi square that I give you. One image of these actually has all the information you need. When we do the analysis, we actually crop to compare all the images the same foot, some footing. We select region of interest centered on the atoms. And here are images from the time of flight of the experiment, and here for what would be the classical case. Here is a simulation starting from the same initial conditions, okay? Just for comparison. If you do the analysis, my colleague Frederico Brito here did the analysis first, and he was very excited in the beginning, we all were, when you do and plot the histogram for this quantity here. When you do that for a quantum system, very often when you have quantized levels, you have quantization of the distribution of the energies. That's what you expect, right? You have separate energies levels from the experiment. And you kind of look like that, and so you look like, oh, maybe that's good, right? So this is the quantization for the sigma. Well, not quite. Not quite. This is wrong. This is actually an artifact due to the images that we're using. We just used the simplest one. And these are 8-bit images. I mean that you have just 256 levels of this discretization for the image. And that creates these values here because you have these gaps for the values for the work distribution. But if you do that the proper way, using like a 60-bit image, which were available for the experiment, you get these nice distributions here. And they kind of look the same for different times. So you actually have to calculate that, the average of this is the distribution of the sigma, that quantity sigma. And if you do that, if you apply the theorem, what you get is this. So remember, this should be 1. So this is the theory, right? So the theory says that this value should be 1 always. No matter what you do, no matter when you look at it. And they're not quite, right? The first one maybe is close enough, depending on the uncertainties and so on. But they clearly go down as you look for different time of flight. So what is causing this? So that puzzled us for a while, but Federico found a very good explanation for that. Well, first we checked the obvious things. Said, could it be some technical thing, maybe the procedure that we're turning off the trap or so on? And that's not the case. The analysis revealed the same deviation for all the references images regardless. So it was something that was very robust in the data. So when that happens, either you are very unlucky or maybe there's something behind that, right? And in this case, it actually does. Because remember, the hypothesis was that we had unitary evolution. That seems natural for a BC, superfluid, in vacuum, all that, right? But that's not really the case. If you see the number that you get from the images at different time of flight, it actually goes down with the time of flight. And that's actually not surprising. I mean, first, that if you do that for one single experiment, you never do that because the image is destructive. So you have to have very reliable system to have the same numbers to start with, or use some other more sophisticated imaging techniques where you can perhaps do quasi non-destructive imaging and so on. But this is not, again, a full surprise because you have in vacuum, but you have collisions with the background, you have the thermal cloud, and as the atom expands, the density goes down, especially in the edges of the cloud, and it gets harder to detect that from the background. So in the end, what happens is that you do see a loss of atoms during time of flight. So if you take that into account, then you don't have a closed system in the quantum sense, in the sense that you have an unitary evolution. And this problem has been studied by Ueda's group a few years back, and he actually was looking at a different thing, completely different idea, very general. And he was describing this thing that he called an absolute irreversibility. And the context here is the following. Remember that I told you that there's a symmetry for the distributions, or for the forward and the reverse process. So when you do that for a classical system, there's a tacit assumption, which is valid in many cases, that, and sometimes it's framed like the tail balance or something, that all the process that leave you forward to some conditions in the, say, future in some time, can be, in principle, reversed. So there's always the reverse trajectories for every process. And that's not the case here. In our case, in the end, you have less atoms that you started, so some of the trajectories that those atoms will do cannot be recovered again. So that's the same framework, the same context that Ueda's paper is describing here. So when he applies that and he makes some assumptions to derive an expression and a correction that you would get from the fluctuation terms in such cases, when there is this irreversible, he called this absolute irreversibility because this is a different irreversibility from the ones that you would get in a classical system. In a classical system, if you do that something fast, out of equilibrium, you get irreversibility. You always produce entropy. You always have entropy production. But in the quantum case, you may start in some subspace of your quantum system, and in the final state, you have a different subspace. And so you may have elements on this vector space that were not present before. So he's talking about, for the quantum case, in these situations where you have this irreversibility due to the statistic, let's say, to the characteristics, the symmetries of the system, and not due to the reversibility of the process itself. Okay? So if you do that, you get this lambda, and he prescribed a way of calculating that. And the shorter, the version of this is that it has to do with the trajectory that disappears. In our case, the trajectories that disappears are because of the atoms that disappear. So this lambda actually turns out to be very easily related to the atoms that we lose from the trap. So if you calculate that from our data, if you take this lambda that is calculated from the experiment and the one from the theory, they are remarkably the same. I mean, it was quite amazing. So this is something that at least shows you that this quantifier seems to be quite robust. And perhaps the description of that the reason why you have the deviation is just because of the loss of the atoms, which I think is very reasonable for our system. So the conclusions is the following. We have carried out here a simple experiment. We're still in the process of analyzing. We didn't publish, we had these results for some time now, but we wanted to get more data so we can do a better statistic and looks in different contests, just to be sure. But if you take any of these images randomly, the chances that these quantifiers will match up the way that they did is very, very small. So we're actually very, very pleased with the results so far. So we have carried out an experimental verification for the fluctuation theorem that I showed you for interacting quantum systems. The key feature of this proposal basically was to find a meaningful and easy to measure, observable. In our case, this sigma actually can obtain from a single shot. If you compare that to the usual method where you would have thousands of images and experiments to build some statistic, this is a very important point. This proposed quantifier, for all we know, it looks like a good candidate to have something with the meaning of this entropy production. It has all the characteristics. And as a bonus, we found this kind of generalization for this concept of absolute irreversibility from Ueda's group. And as far as we know, this is the first time this is shown for open quantum systems. So what is the perspective? This is basically the last slide. So since this quantity is easily accessible and it seems to have all the properties and behave like entropy production, maybe we can use that to link with the thermodynamics. So like following the usual tradition from statistical mechanics, you have some assumption, you say you have an ensemble, microcanonical, whatever. You find a way to connect with the thermodynamics, some quantities from this, and from that you derive everything. So this is, if you follow the same idea, there are well-established protocols and procedures to deal with, once you have this entropy production, to calculate these thermodynamic quantities. But now you can do this for non-equilibrium cases. So I think this might be a very important perspective and maybe a nice way to go about studying BECs or quantum fluids in general out of equilibrium, using this framework from quantum stochastic thermodynamics. There's a lot of fun things to try and explore in experiments and so on, and we're very excited about that. Just to conclude, let me show you the people from my lab. This is a node picture from 2017. Many of these people graduated, moved on, and so on. Some faces are here and are familiar to you. There's a more recent picture. This was just before the pandemic, just the day before we start to the quarantine, the forced quarantine because of the pandemic. Hopefully we'll have another picture soon. But here, there are several people here that you will recognize. Mario presented the poster. Bruno is probably here. There are some people here from the group. Artur is here that was not in the picture at the time. Particularly there's Talita. And again, if you haven't seen her poster yet, I suggest you to see because she gives you a good example from the thermodynamic system. Lucas Kamizaki defended his master thesis just last week on this topic as well, and so on. There are a lot of people that we want to thank, of course, the funding, the agencies, and so on. So with that, thanks for the opportunity, and I'm available if you have questions. Thank you.
You have a question? Oh, no. Sorry. More questions? Please. Okay.
Okay, Sergio. Nice. I think the idea of non-equilibrium is what is a big challenge now, and many things is going on, including from all scales, from molecules, single molecules to many bodies. I'm talking about the quantum system, right? So I have a few little questions. One is, when we're dealing with the quantum mechanics system, we saw a very nice talk of Nicholas Prokalps from Newcastle on the stochastic approach of Grosseteste equation or quantum mechanics. How that fits in your kind of thing? And he do not need to define, he just need a kind of bet of noise that will keep things going.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's actually very different. They do consider stochastic processes to emulate, to create a situation where you have a theory for BECs that has finite temperature, right? So in short, what usually these approaches do, you have the condensate fraction, and you have occupations of the other states that represents the thermal cloud, and that's where the temperature is. So that is important to reproduce the results of some experiments that you do with BECs. When these approaches were proposed way back then, there was a very nice experiment where they were colliding in BECs, or smashing against each other, and the theory was able to predict very well the results that they were observing. If you just use Grosseteste, zero temperature, you wouldn't get that. But as far as I know, there's not really, or at least there might be some now, studies of the thermodynamics of this process. I mean, it's a way of doing that, but it's really different in the framework. This framework from quantum stochastic thermodynamics, or stochastic thermodynamics in general, allows you to define very precisely these quantities work and heat from these stochastic trajectories. For the BEC, that's not really the case that you do when you do stochastic GPE, for instance. You're considering these classical parts, these other excitations, but you're not really quantifying and calculating work from these fractions and so on. So it has similar names, but the idea is very different. Said that, we are actually very interested in looking to that. I talked with Mario, and we have a student that is actually probably watching the video lectures from home, Juventino. He's starting a project for IC, scientific initiation with us. And we actually are starting to look into performing simulations of finite temperature BECs, and now from those simulations, getting the data and putting in this quantifier and seeing how they relate, and then if you get some meaningful thermodynamics quantities from that. So that's a long answer, but it's in short, those descriptions is different, and as far as I know, they don't describe the same quantities, and it's not obvious how you define quantities like heat or work for the GPE description. At least I don't know anything about that.
You mentioned about the thermodynamics, and you said that efficiency or the quantum system may be more efficient. Do you have a strong belief that we're going to violate the limit of the efficiency in a quantum engine?
Well, depends who you believe. I mean, there are many papers in the literature for quantum systems that have shown, I mean, papers from very respectable groups in high-impact journals, and including groups from Brazil, that have shown quantum engines where they use some particular cycles, and the efficiency that they calculate from these engines are larger than Carnot. So there's a huge discussion in the literature, because some people say, well, that's not quite fair, because you're using resources that are not accounted for when you do the ratios, so no wonder that you get something larger. Other people say, well, but that's the beauty of quantum, we have these extra resources. But in any case, there's some discussions about that, and I don't want to get there. That's why I didn't show these results. The result that I show you is more undisputable in the sense that it shows something that doesn't rely on that. It's not about efficiency, it's about power. So what that result in particular shows, there's a feedback here that I should avoid, not to annoy the people watching at YouTube. So what that result shows is that for this quantum heat engine, you can get more power out. Power is not something that you normally look at when you look for Carnot. Carnot is quasi-static in equilibrium. The power is 0, right? But there the efficiency, the ratios of the amount of work by the amount of heat that you extract from the source is the meaningful quantity. But as I showed you, you can extract, you can write the same efficiency in terms of ratios. And I think, at least for now, because of these discussions about how you define work and heat for quantum systems, there is still some debate about this question. But some people will say that for quantum engines, you do have efficiencies larger than Carnot. But this is something that there's no consensus about that yet. I mean, about this interpretation, no questions about the experiment. That's not the point.
Now, a final comment. You know, I am a very optimistic guy. I see things where it's hard to believe that they are there, right? I normally believe in them, even in a noisy signal.
I know you very well.
But it seems a little bit more conservative when you are calculating the sigma from the time of flight and comparing the center. Because as we let the cloud evolve, the edges of the cloud, we know that. Even if the number is conserved, we confuse the number with the noise as it grows. And then we kind of losing a little bit resolution. And so I think that should be a little careful. And I was impressed that agrees so well with the theory, the lambda, which is the correction, right?
Yes.
And, but you know, experiments always should have uncertainty. And I think doing the time of flight always have systematic involved because we lose as we wait longer. So depend what you're going to see. So my I don't know if it's a question or recommendation. Can we do more than just rely in a few points?
Yes, so that's a very, very important question and fair question. And that's why actually we hold up from publishing this result, because we wanted to have more analysis. We didn't have quite enough data from the sample. But one thing so the short answer is yes, we do want to look more carefully about these uncertainties in these numbers and do more experiments. But there's something that I forgot to mention here. The beauty of this formulation is this number here is that you get from the theory. I mean, these numbers from the experiment and actually the other ones that you get for the sigma 2 are all experimental data. And there's no assumptions that you have to do about any of that. So when you do usually a description, you have to make some assumptions about what you do, what's your model, what is your evolution for your density matrix, whatever. If the system is open, you have to come with some sort of master equation, whatever. Here, there's nothing of that. What is shown here is just from the data. I'm taking just the image, just that simple definition, calculating here. There's nothing else here. The same for the lambda. The lambda is simply, actually, I just want here. The lambda is basically simply the difference from this ratio here. This is actually from the experiment. This here is the number that I get at a given time of flight divided by the number of atoms that I had at the reference. Just that. This is the ratio of the number that I had. So that's why it's normalized. To apply the theorem, I have to normalize. And this lambda is just a difference from one, a subtract from the unity. And the chances that you get this number for any given image looking exactly the same with that quantity that represents, that quantity is what you're summing for all the pixels in the image is very little. So I'm not saying that this is any sort of proof, but it's remarkable. And that's something that, I mean, there's a self-consistency in these quantifiers as a rule. But of course, if you had the chance of doing other experiments, perhaps defining other quantum thermodynamic quantities that we can compare, and you can, for instance, do something out of equilibrium, where you can apply this, or you can do very statically, where you do quantities in equilibrium, and you yourself did several experiments for equilibrium thermodynamics on this system. Then we can actually have more evidence to build and compare. So as I said, this is just the beginning. As a first proposal and the first demonstration, there's a lot to do in experiment and see how far we can go with this interpretation.
Okay. Okay, I think it's the time for go on. Thank you very much, Sergio.
There's no questions for the YouTube. There's no question for the YouTube.
Oh,
from the YouTube.
I just saw, but you can pode responder no chat, Sérgio.
Sure.
Responde lá mesmo.
Okay, there's Giacomo now.
They are just installing.
Okay, so should I just turn it off here?
Pode deixar aqui, Sérgio, mas se quiser tirar de perto.
Let me turn this off.
Hi, Giacomo. We are not listening to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Okay. Hi. Nice to see you.
Oh, Giacomo, how are you?
Hi, everyone. Okay, so it's expected that I share the screen. Pat, can you see the screen?
Yes, we see everything. We just don't see you, but I think it's just.
If you want to see me, then I have to understand. Oh, you want me to see? I mean, maybe you can see me at the end, or you want me to see now? Okay, let's do this.
Yeah, I think it's nice to see you.
Yeah, wait. I can do it. Sorry, because I missed this, and then I do this, and then I do this, and then I do this. Now you should also see me.
Yes, now it's working. We see you. We see the presentation.
Super. Okay.
Okay, so I will do a brief presentation, Giacomo. Just wait a few minutes, and then you will start. So, hi, everybody. We are now at our last talk of this school. So it's the last one. And for the last one, we have Dr. Giacomo Huati, that is already with us here in the screen. So I will do a very brief presentation of Giacomo. He's a very, he has been a collaborator for a very long time with the group. And he did his PhD in 2003 at the University of Trento, working with Professor Massimo Inguscio at Lens in Florence, where he studied quantum degenerate mixtures of rubidium and potassium. Later, he did some very short postdocs periods, including at MIT, and he returned to Florence, where he started an experiment with degenerate Fermi gases of lithium-6, for which he received a ERC grant in 2012. Since 2018, Giacomo is a CNR INO director of research, and he has realized very important studies on quantum transport phenomena in strongly correlated Fermi gases during the past years. Now, he's starting to explore these systems in quasi-2D geometries, and today he will talk to us about these new studies in the seminar, the talk titled Quantum Vortex Collider. Okay, so thank you very much, Giacomo, and you can start.
So, first of all, good morning, everyone. It is very nice to attend this school as last speaker. And of course, I would have liked to be there, but the reason, I mean, the situation was not good enough for me to travel to Brazil, but I do hope that I can do and I can travel there soon. So, and thank you, Patricia, for the very nice introduction. So, as said by Patricia, I'm going to discuss with you about some results that we have performed during last year in Florence, here in Florence, on studying vortex dynamics in a quasi-two-dimensional Fermi superfluid. So before starting, I would really like to thank people that participate to this work. And in particular, I want to acknowledge Wujin Kovan, now that is a senior postdoc in my group, and then Giulia Del Pace and Francesco Scazza that also collaborate quite heavily to these measurements. And then we had the collaboration of the theory group by Cledia Ksani, that in fact is here like a postdoc with me, and Luca Galantucci, that you know that you have listened the last days, working in the group in Newcastle. So I am the last speaker, so probably all the students and all the people have learned many things during these 2 weeks about ultra cold matter. So I will give you anyway a small recap of what are the features of this system that make them such interesting. Of course, in this system, as you know, you can tune the interaction, you can tune then population, for example, spin population, and you can study regimes of strong correlation in both attractive and repulsive regime. And the other thing that is very important and will be very important for what I'm going to tell you, they are very nice because on this system, you can tailor optical potential using light, of course, that are made by laser light. And you can arrange this potential in lattices. You can create disorder potential, for example, or you can create even more exotic lattices. For example, this is a honeycomb-like lattice that should in some way mimic a graphene pattern. And I would say that another thing that is super interesting is that you can mix, of course, this kind of potential on one system. For example, you can study disorder on a lattice, like a regular lattice, or for example, a honeycomb-like lattice to study some sort of disordered graphene completely on demand. Okay, you know that we are in a moment of history in which quantum technologies are really taking a very important part in our society. So an ultra cold matter, atomic matter, if you want, becomes very interesting also from this side. And we can call them like synthetic materials or quantum materials that are very nice to implement a quantum simulation scheme. Okay, as you have seen from the title, I'm going to discuss about vortex. And okay, as Vanderlei group, and Vanderlei, of course, is one of the main experts in the world of this, vortices in our case are typically connected to superfluidity or superconductivity. So here just I want to remind students, I mean, of what happened like almost 100 years ago, where, I mean, Kamerlingh Holmes discovered the onset of superconductivity. So he discovered that something happened, and the experiment left no doubt that as far as accuracy of measurement went, the resistance disappeared. So something very, very funny and very fuzzy happened. And this, from that moment, they call superconductivity. Of course, the superconductivity and superfluidity are indeed spectacular and quantum phenomena, and they show up in many different systems in nature. And here I just listed, of course, some of them. And of course, in atomic Bose-Einstein system, atomic gases. So probably this is redundant, but I typically like to show this because without no comment. Typically, they are associated to particular properties that are absence of friction or resistance, or in some way, to better say, in the case of superconductor, to the expulsion of the magnetic field by the Marsden effect, or in the case of helium, you can have viscosity, the absence of viscosity below a critical temperature. Well, typically we like to describe, a way to describe this system, a superconductor or a superfluid, is the order parameter. And the order parameter is a function that has an amplitude and a phase. While the amplitude, as you will see, is connected to the condensate fraction or the superfluid fraction, the phase is related to a macroscopic motion of the fluid or the superfluid. And in fact, the velocity is related to the gradient of the phase, of such phase. My point of view is that the order parameter is the fundamental is fundamental since it discloses all the property of the supercondensate, of the condensate or the superfluid state. And in some way, the quantum statistics shape the excitation spectrum that is still encoded in the order parameter. And in fact, the excitation spectrum is something that determines the macroscopic behavior of the superfluid and also relates to how and which are the mechanisms can destroy or can increase the dissipation in the system. Okay, this again for students and is obvious for all the senior people. In fact, in an experiment that we perform in cold gases, in the case of BC, we directly measure the order parameter. In fact, for us, the condensate fraction is the order parameter, and is something that we can do measure, because we can really, by time of flight, measure the condensate fraction and the non-condensate fraction. So this is the way in which typically we access to this in such system. Again, since this is intended for students, and most of the students probably are sufficiently young, it is worth to mention that what I'm going to describe, and probably also what other speaker and lecturer described in the last weeks for you, was triggered by Debbie Jean, that unfortunately passed away recently. And she was the first that observed the so-called fermionic condensate. And typically I like to read part of this, that was a press release for after the publication of the physical review letters, in which, again, they were demonstrating fermionic superfluidity. She said that we report is the first observation of a fermionic condensate in ultra-cold gases. This is a new form of matter, okay, related to Bose-Einstein condensate and superconductivity. However, our fermionic condensate is not a Bose-Einstein condensate and not a superconductor, but is really something new. And from this we start. And many groups started from the 2004, approaching and studying Fermi superfluidity in case of lithium atoms or potassium-40 atoms. Why such systems are interesting? Because in our system, we can tune by flashback resonances the scattering length between two internal states of lithium or potassium. I will enter this later with some more precise definition, but what is important that we can tune the scattering length. Here I report on the X scale, the interaction parameter that is defined by Kf times A minus 1, where Kf is the Fermi wave vector. And on the Y scale, we have T over Tf, where Tf is the temperature of the Fermi temperature of the system. Well, tuning the interaction and below a critical temperature, we can study the onset of condensation in the BC regime, in which this fermionic spin state pair and become really molecule, lithium-2 in my case. Then if you go on the other side, for negative KFA to the minus 1, you access the so-called BCS-like regime that is some way resemble the Bardeen-Cooper pairing that you have in superconductor. And when where the interaction parameter, in fact, is mathematically speaking, becoming infinite, and so 1 over Kf is becoming 0, so where the scattering length diverge, you have the so-called superfluid at unitarity that correspond to a very strongly correlated system in which the Cooper pair size is almost equal to the mean interparticle spacing. And here I just propose you that, pictorially, the different realization that you can have in nature, or close to this, of course, with differences, but just to give you some idea. In this case, in the BC limit, you can think about helium-4. In the case of BCS, you can think about a superconductor, while at unitarity, the physics and the equation of state resemble the behavior of a neutron star. Okay, so probably this you have seen, but it's just to give you another flavor on this. So this is a flashback resonance. So you have the scattering length between two internal spin states. This is the magnetic field that we tune. And this is the dispersive relation that you have for the scattering length, in which you have the background scattering length. So that is the 0, 1, the zero field 1. And then you have this relation that relates with the size of the flashback resonances with the variation of the magnetic field with respect to the center of the flashback resonances. Okay, so for negative value of B in this side, and in particular in this part here, you have the so-called BC limit, in which again these fermion pairs will just bound in a molecular state. And of course, since we are talking about fermions, they become a boson. A molecule is boson, in fact, nature, and then can boson-condense. This is a two-body pairing because exists in the two-body problem a molecular bound state. If you go on the other side, where the scattering length in principle is negative, and in this side here, of course also here, but you will have some other problem, so don't consider this part in the moment, let's consider only this part here. You have the so-called BCS side. There is no two-body bound state. The scattering length, in fact, is negative, and atoms still can form Cooper pairs, but this is a many-body pairing. Then you have this region here, that is the so-called unitary limit, which, in fact, bound state and open channel continuous energy are degenerate, and the scattering length, mathematically speaking, diverge. That means that anyway, the cross-section is 1/k² limited by quantum mechanics. This is the so-called crossover superfluidity or unitary superfluidity. And here again, we talk about a many-body pairing because there is no effective two-body bound state. So by tuning the magnetic field, we can access these three regimes. Well, now I enter more in the philosophical part, probably how to probe this quantum nature. Of course, you have two aspects that are quite related to this state. One is the condensation, and the other one is superfluidity. I will not enter any discussion about if one implies the other, but of course there are, and I was listening the other day to Bill Phillips. Of course, if you change interaction, if you go to 2D, if you go, I mean, things can be more complicated. But typically in 3D, for finite interaction, of course, these two, for Bose-Einstein condensate, these are equivalent at equals 0. How do you probe this? Well, one way to probe condensation is to study, for example, Josephson effect, because this directly relates the current that you measure in an experiment. This, for example, are junction done with atoms in the group of Henning Moritz in Hamburg. This is done in Florence, and this is a superconducting junction. So you measure a current, you get the condensate fraction because the current is related to the condensate pairs. Then you can study some other kind of geometry, and for example, to study persistent current. And this probably is still related to something connected to both, to the superfluid nature and the condensate fraction. And again, this is a superconducting ring. And this is something that I will mention at the end of my talk, that is our superfluid Fermi ring that we have here in Florence. And then, of course, if you want to study something more related to superfluidity only, then of course you study vortices. And this again is the Martins-Virlen vortex lattice in Fermi superfluid from MIT. And this is something that I got from Google. I mean, this is ITC superconductor that is pierced by magnetic field. Well, just because I don't want that, I mean, this is not, of course, something that is my only from my mind. This is something that is very well known. So vortices are really at the heart of superfluidity. And again, I want to share you, I mean, one sentence by the Nobel Prize Eric Cornell, just shortly. Anytime you think about superfluidity, you have to think about vortices. So nature tells you that a superfluid typically and vortex behavior are connected. But of course, this is not totally true, because again, you can have a situation in which vortex happens also in classical fluids. For example, this is a hurricane. So you have a typical structure that resembles a vortex, and on the right here you have again something that you can see, you can measure the behavior in a Fermi superfluid from Martin MIT. So you typically like to describe the circulation. That is something that in some way I will use like a discriminant to separate between classical vorticity and quantum vorticity. Because in classical system, gamma can assume any value. And as you know, instead, in case of quantum system, gamma must be quantized. Okay, you can derive quite easily this. And of course, this again reflects on the fact that the velocity of a superfluid is directly linked to the gradient of the phase of the order parameter. Well, another question that we can ask is, okay, now we have both in both system, in both environments, classical and quantum, we have vortices. What about the dissipation mechanism? Well, again, in classical system, anyway, vortices can lose their energy using, through viscous friction. But the question is how instead a quantum vortex can dissipate inside a system in which typically friction is not allowed. Well, I will not enter too much detail, but the point is the following, is that we can separate, if you want, the energy and the momentum that is associated to the system in two kinds of energy scale. One energy scale is the incompressible energy that is typically associated to the vortex field energy. On the other side, you know that there are other excitations that can happen in the superfluid that are more related to the compressible energy that in fact are related to the sound wave or sound field energy. So, of course, one question is possible to study such a phenomenology? It is possible also to study how compressible energy, so vortex and compressible energies, all sound, can interact. Well, of course, there are many theoretical work, and I know Vanderlei, of course, is aware of, study also this in many details, that is connected, for example, to quantum turbulence, in which vortex reconnection eventually produce sound, Kelvin waves that are related to that. Or there are completely different systems in which, for example, accelerating charged particle can in some way mimic the behavior of vortex and sound propagation. Well, the first thing that we have to consider anyway is that can happen that the system is not fully condensed, for example. Maybe we are in a situation in which we have some part of the fluid that is the so-called normal. Well, for example, vortices can lose energy by interaction between themselves and the normal fluid. This we typically can associate to finite temperature effect because we can consider the fact that at T equals 0, all the system, for example, the Bose-Einstein condensate is fully condensed. And so there is not a normal part. Of course, and again, this was done in the group of Nick Prokakis that was mentioned just before by Vanderlei, and they did some study how a vortex can precess changing, temperature, and they were extracting in harmonic trap this, and they were extracting the so-called alpha coefficient, that is the mutual friction coefficient, that in some way is the degree or something that is related to how the system dissipate by mutual friction. And what they observe in this theoretical work is that the mutual friction increase versus temperature. And this, of course, is T over Tc is the critical temperature for Bose-Einstein condensation. And this way, there are many studies, in fact, also done in the group of Shin in Seoul, in which they were observing how the mutual friction, in the case of multi-vortex preparation, this is a Bose-Einstein condensate, was affecting, in fact, the relative motion between vortices. So mutual friction, we can consider like typically a mechanism that should be there for finite temperature system. This is not true, of course, only for Bose-Einstein condensate. And for Bose-Einstein condensate, of course, these are part of a general superfluid system or superconducting system, but I will just give you the flavor of what happened in a superfluid helium. Because also in this case, there is the insertion of this mutual friction coefficient that in some way used like a phenomenological term that must describe any sort of dissipation. And as you know, in the case of, for example, this is a treatment that you can extract from this paper, but you can have two kinds of force that can affect vortex. One is the mutual friction. And the other one is the fact that anyway, the vortex move. inside the medium. Okay, that is the so-called Magnus force. So anyway, this will combine and give you, in fact, the effect of friction of vortices, or the way in which the vortices can dissipate energy in such superfluids. And there were measurements, of course, done. And this, I will not enter too much in the detail, but they were measuring both helium-4 and helium-3, some sort of viscosity versus temperature. And they were extracting this, and they were finding very interesting that anyway, in both experiments, oh, sorry for that, anyway, the friction or the effective viscosity was not really going to zero. Okay, it was decreasing with temperature, because you think that then the mutual friction, the normal part decreased, so you expect that this term become less important, but eventually was not, in fact, going completely to zero. So let's say we can think that even at ultra low temperature, there must be something also in this non-viscous system that can affect, if you want, the behavior of the energy dissipation of vortices. One case, I mean, again, this is just a summary slide. We have finite temperature mechanisms that are due to the exchange of momentum between vortex and normal fluid. On the other side, even at equal zero, there should be another mechanism that we can think is associated to sound, in which vortices can dissipate energy in other excitation. For example, emitting sound. Well, typically this is quite complicated to disentangle. For sure, it's very difficult to see in a typical condensed matter system like helium. And the other question that we wanted to raise and to answer, in fact, to address is even is how the superfluid nature, or better, like this is wrong, how the nature of the superfluid play a role in the vortex dynamics or in the dissipation of vortices. I told you already that we can tune the interaction between BC and BCS, so we can really scan all the possible superfluid in nature, from purely bosonic to quite fermionic behavior. So is this change of statistics affect in some way the vortex dynamics? Very long introduction. This is what we did to address this. So the summary is that I will tell you how we produce homogeneous quasi-2D Fermi superfluid, and I will tell you how we realize a programmable quantum vortex collider. And then I will end some physics. So how we study collision, in fact, and annihilation. So means really we study both mutual friction and sound emission. And then I will just give you 2 slides about part. I mean, actually, this is almost a ready paper, but what we did in the last months in ring geometries. So just for being clear, we studied lithium-6. We use 2 internal spin states that are the lowest internal spin state of lithium that we can call down-up spin, just to say. And this is our Feshbach resonances that we use for tuning the interaction. Then what we do, we created the gas. This is our Fermi superfluid. And then we image with high resolution through a high numerical aperture objective. And at the same time, we imprint arbitrary potential with DMD. Okay, these are devices that are the same that you find in your projector that, in fact, I think is some way projecting slides. So we can imprint any potential that we want using laser light and this device that, in fact, is like an array of many mirrors that can be active or non-active, just to say very shortly. And we can, in fact, imprint almost anything we want, as Patricia knows very well. And this is, for example, is the skyline of Florence on a Fermi superfluid in 2D. Okay, and we can do, of course, with high resolution given the objective. So we prepare, in fact, a 2D system using a method that was, I think, implemented the first time by Jean Dalibard at École Normale. So we produce a 3D gas with some technique that I don't have time to tell you, and then we squeeze them the atoms in a TM01 beam profile, blue detuned, that create a sort of pancake, a biscuit. And then this is the profile. So this is our gas. We decide to work with circle. And so this is quite flat for our purpose. And then again, here we can use now 2DMD, one in the vertical so that we'll enter inside the screen. I cannot show you, but enter inside the screen here. And then we have a second DMD that can address the atoms from lateral side. These are the numbers, and this is more or less the temperature. So we are well below the critical temperature for Fermi superfluidity. So why did we decide to study a collider? Okay, this is my funny slide probably, because typically collision can help to reveal properties of the system. In some way, from the product of the collision, you can learn a lot about the system itself. Okay, and we have a topical example. For example, we have, the collider in Geneva, the future one, and then they have this baby that wants to crash the horse because she's expecting to find things inside. So anyway, collisions are important, and we decided to create this from the perspective to study vortex dynamics and vortex dissipation in a controlled way. Because in fact, what we wanted and we want is to study the intimate dissipation mechanism, and this will be general true for all the superfluids. And at the same time, we wanted, given the quantum technology perspective, to realize a minimum and scalable and programmable platform that is in fact very similar to what people now study in optical tweezer, to investigate vortex dynamics and vortex phenomena, but adding in the system one vortex by one vortex. And of course, this will be a strong perspective to study quantum turbulence, of course, but adding up vortices. How do we do this? So we use an idea that in fact was developed in another group by Anderson in 2016, but we perform this with DMD. So will be difficult probably since I'm not in presence, but I will try with the mouse to show. We start with, in fact, the DMD with two beams that are located in this position, and then they move separating with an angle, with some velocity. So this is what you will see in situ when these dimples are kept on. And this is what you see in time of flight after that these dimples are released. So you see that after the release, if you overcome critical velocity, you will form a dipole vortex, a vortex dipole. I will indicate 1 and 2. And these are the vortex dipole image. Okay, so in this picture, there are no beams. These are pure vortices. Okay, then probably you see the movie. We produce the vortex dipole, and then we let move evolving in the trap. And then you see, in the movie, you see that they will just evolve, move. Here there are the walls, bunch, and then we'll do a precession motion that is well reproduced by Grosby-Tajewski, of course, in this case. What is interesting is that the vortex dipole number reach a fidelity of almost 100% for critical velocity. Okay? Above a critical velocity, that is in this case, for example, 0.15, the local speed of sound. And again, what is interesting is that we can control quite nicely the distance between the vortex dipole, so the size of the vortex dipole, because this depends on the angle that we decide to use in the vortex beam preparation. And then the question is, why do we want to study vortex dipole? This was a very nice idea by Vujin, because of course, vortex dipole, in physics, you like to measure frequencies, no? People like to have the reference in time and frequency, because you can have, in principle, you can measure frequency very nicely. But the second thing that you can measure typically such nice, not maybe the same level, but even in a very good level, is a distance. And then for a vortex dipole, the distance is important because d is the size of the dipole, and this is directly related to the momentum. And at the same time, the energy of the vortex dipole is proportional to the logarithm of this d. That means that if you measure d very nicely, you access to many properties, actually the fundamental properties of the dipole itself. So the first measurement that we did was very simple. we just prepare a vortex dipole with some velocity, and then we let evolve, and then of course it propagates. And from the size of the dipole, we can access to the dissipation. So dipoles that do not shrink in size, they are not dissipating. If we observe a decrease of the size, that means that the energy of the vortex must go in some, should go in some way, in some place. This is our measurement done for unitary and BC, and this is for BCS. Let me explain. We start at 0 time with vortex dipole of this size in micron. The BCS must be prepared larger, because if we do not prepare larger, we see annihilation, self-annihilation. So this is just why we have to prepare like this, so that let you already think that there is some physics that is strongly connected to the size, to the kind of superfluid that we study. But anyway, you see that passing time, so during the evolution, the vortex dipole size decrease. We can use at the moment a model that is a simple model that is called dissipative point vortex model, which we include, given the velocity of the vortex, the circulation of the vortex, a coefficient alpha that is, in fact, the so-called mutual friction coefficient. That is something that we can then directly measure. And these are the results. So you see, this is, again, the interaction parameter. So this side is the BC, this side is the BCS, and 0 is unitary. And you can see, I mean, we have an increase of dissipation moving from the BC to BCS, superfluid. Okay, the physics now becomes more complicated, and still we are studying this in some way, and we have also some theory collaboration by a group that can really perform a numerical simulation on strongly correlated Fermi system. But the idea here is the following, can be, again, give you a flavor, because again, also from my side is a flavor. So in the case of a BCS and the unitary as well, superfluid, the vortex core is not empty, okay? But there are particles that can be there because there are existing the so-called under-bound state inside the vortex core. And in this vortex core means that quasi-particle or normal particle, depends as you want to call, can be inside, can be filling up the vortex. And in fact, if you see, I mean, if you want to image vortices in the in the BCS or in the unitary limit, you have to sweep to the BC. Okay, there are many reasons. One reason, of course, is that in that case, the vortices are not such clear. And so you need to proceed a sweep to the BC. Anyway, that is a technical part. Alpha increase moving to BCS, meaning that we have additional friction, probably can be due to the fact that quasi-particle filling up the core of the vortex core, of the vortices, interact with the vortex, and with the normal part itself. There is a scattering between particle inside the vortex core and quasi-particle outside the vortex. Then, of course, the other thing that we wanted to do is something even more fancy, if you want. We can prepare two vortex dipole, one on one side and the other one on the other side. So we need to have to doubling the procedure. To have two, actually, starting from a 4 beam, in fact, from different side of the superfluid, and then we produce the vortex dipole pair, and then we launch one against the other, and then we want to see what happened. And these are the trajectories. So this is exactly experimental data. So we have vortex dipole 1, vortex dipole 2, move one against the other, and then we see the approach, and then the one is moving in this trajectory. And if you want, the main point is that they exchange partners. So the one start with 2, but then finish with 3, and the 2 start with 1 and finish with 4. And this is an example done. These are images in time of flight. We have vortex 1, dipole 1, vortex dipole 2. This is the approach, and this is the output of the collision. This is done for large dipole enough, for which we do not have self-annihilation. Then what we can do, of course, to increase, if you want, in some way, or to study different geometry, we can study head-on collision or with 120 degrees collision. And then, which is the way in which we can estimate if the system during the collision lose energy. Well, the idea is simple. So we just we decided to use this, gamma, of course, now not the circulation is, let's call dissipation term, like you want to call, is a dimensional. But anyway, is the ratio between the vortex dipole sizes at the end and at the beginning. And then we see if this number, of course, change, that means that we are losing energy in some way. So this graph is complicated, but I will tell you in some way the detail. Gamma on the Y, so for the moment, look only this panel. Gamma on the Y, and then we have on the X scale, we have the initial size of the vortex dipole in healing length. And this is done for BC. All these data are for BC. And you can see, and this, okay, the different colors are for the different kind of collision. So this is the yellow is head-on, and the pink is the 120-degree collision. You see that decreasing the initial size of the dipole, we see that dissipation increase because this term start to be not 1. And increase, and at a certain moment, we do not have any more, if you want, data set here. And this is just to tell you that the system is doing something that I will describe in 1 second in the lower panel. So just to tell you what are the dotted line, this is the point vortex model that anyway just tells you that the system should dissipate by mutual friction. And you can see that after a while, the point vortex model cannot catch anymore the data. On the other side, we see that GP, that is this shaded area, can catch the behavior, even though no mechanism of dissipation is included, but just because for the BC, the alpha coefficient is sufficiently small. So I want to just to tell you before you ask me that there is no dissipative term in the Gross-Pitayevsky. So it's good that it catch, but it catch just because the system is is not dissipating hardly. Okay, otherwise we should have added a dissipative term inside the Gross-Pitayevsky. What is also interesting, and is the inset, is that for the same system, that is the initial size, this is the so-called compressible energy. So calculation is a calculation. This that tells you that reducing the size of the dipole, this term starts to increase, meaning that the compressible part of the energy increase. So sound energy is increasing. Of course, this we can't measure directly in the experiment. This is just numerical simulation. In the lower panel, we just measure, but is the probability of annihilation. So the probability that we do not see any vortex dipole at the end of the collision. And this we start to see that decreasing the size of the vortex dipole. Of course, we can think that in some way, vortex dipole collision is related then to sound emission. We redid the same characterization, so this is exactly the same plot that you have already seen for unitary Fermi gas and for BCS superfluids. Here there is no GP. We can't perform, this will not work. There is only the point vortex model that completely fails very clearly. The thing that, of course, the scale is slightly different because this is not the healing length for the condensate, this is the 1/kf. But just to be roughly saying, is that we see that in both unitary and BCS superfluid, dissipation happens for larger dipoles, initial dipoles. Okay, so this scale you don't have just to consider like this, but anyway, the message is that BCS and unitary dipoles dissipate at larger distance. And again, the dissipation is quite strong in the BCS, is super strong. Again, probably telling you that something else is happening. So probably also here, the nature of the core is acting as extra term for dissipation. Okay, the quasi-particle inside the vortex core can really scatter and create an extra term. Well, then we decided to do the last thing that for us was a sort of holy grail. Can we see annihilation of vortex dipole and emission of light, of sound? Then we did the experiment. So we prepare dipole with sufficiently large size that anyway were not self-annihilating, okay, but sufficiently small that maybe we could expect something different happening than just normal collision. And this is what we see. Okay, the upper panels are experiments, and the lower panels here are the theory, the Gross-Pitayevsky. So this is for molecular BC, just to have the theory on below, but the same can be observed with some detail different in the other regimes. These are the two vortex dipole colliding, and you see there is a moment in which you don't see anymore them, but you start to see something that is a density wave propagating outside. And the same for other geometries. And these are exactly the simulation. So what we see here, we see that during and after, as a consequence, as you want to say, of the collision, vortex dipole annihilates and form a sound wave. Okay, so this is what, of course, is the observation. We extract in some way critical vortex sizes, the vortex dipole sizes for the annihilation process in all the BC-BCS crossover. Okay, so again, in the BC-BCS crossover, in the BCS and the unitary gas, we cannot exclude other mechanisms that can affect and make the observation slightly more complicated, but we also there observed the annihilation processes due to the collision. So now to switch to the last 2 minutes, because then, of course, this will be connected, but not for this moment, maybe for a next time. So now we change geometry also in the direction to study vortex dynamics, but initially we wanted to characterize the geometry. And in particular, what we realize is a ring Fermi superfluid. And I know because Bill Phillips already mentioned this, but this is our version. So we start with an oblate Fermi superfluid. And then we use DMD. And then you probably, we start some movie, you will see. And then what we do is to shape a potential. And with in some way, we create our ring. So it's homogeneous. And the nice thing of this is that these are the numbers that we can, of course, tune the size. And given the resolution that we have, now we can do even better than this, probably we are up to 1.8 micron, we can create very thin ring. So the message is that we have a tunable ring geometry in which we have Fermi superfluid, no Bose superfluid. So it's again across the BC-BCS crossover. And what is nice, okay, this is just a caveat, just to mention, sorry, is that if this size start to become comparable with some correlation length of the BCS superfluid, meaning that we can have a ring which thickness becomes comparable with the size of the Cooper pair. And so, of course, this becomes like one dim for the Cooper pair. So everything can be then also different. And there is for sure new physics happening there. By the way, happening also in normal metal ring that I don't know if many of you know, can also present persistent current even in the normal state. Anyway, going above from this, we can produce such geometry. And what we can do, again, is to study a way to manipulate this time the phase of the order parameter. And what we do is to use a gradient of intensity that we just shine on the ring. So anyway, as yesterday was asked, or yesterday, I don't remember, was yesterday or today is deep, I don't remember, sorry for this. But there was a question for Bill Phillips, why to use, or how to use, why to use, in fact, spiral counting to extract the winding number. Actually, I already answered the question, so I don't need to tell you more on this. But the idea is again, also applied in our case. So we have a ring, and then we have a reference. So this is a sort of homodyne detection. So we imprint the phase only on the external ring, and then we use time of flight to extract the winding number. If you want, this is we can call like a sort of quantum amperometer, because it's a very effective way to extract and to measure winding number. So the circulation that you imprint using this formula and this optical technique. This is what happens. So this is a time of flight. Probably you have seen this, but this is done for Fermi superfluid mapped on the BC side. But again, this is no imprinting. You have perfect round shape and symmetric fringe. And then you start to build up spiral as soon as you increase the winding number and the phase imprinted on the system. What I found very interesting is that, of course, this cannot be, at the end, in the stationary, I mean, in the statistical point of view, cannot assume all the values. It must be quantized, because is what happened for such quantum system. And probably this is not the best picture, but this was just to give you the idea, a sort of a zoo of what we can do with the nice fringe. But then this is the best picture to compare with. So this is the winding number, and this is the imprinted phase. And you can see that they move a step of pi to pi, okay? So like is expected to be. And this exactly is the same physics that happened in a superconducting ring, which a trapped flux versus the magnetic field show exactly this step behavior. So the two parts, I mean, are completely analogous from the point of view of the fundamental physics. So what we want to do? Okay, there are many things that we want to study. In principle, now with the vortex collider, we can study even more complicated geometry. But our idea is, for example, to study vortex dipole dynamics, eventually in presence of disorder, to study pinning and unpinning mechanism. Because of course, the nice thing is that we can add one vortex dipole, and we can study even one vortex dipole with fidelity of 100%. Of course, the same can happen in ring, where instead vortex dynamics can be approached on in another way, related to persistent current, for example, in presence of defects, or with other mechanisms related to, for example, hydrodynamical instability that can be addressed and studied in such geometries. And with that, I really thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to answer your question. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Giacomo. It was really, really nice. So
Thank you, Pat.
I will open for questions. So do we have any questions in the audience? Yeah.
Hi, Giacomo. Thank you for the nice talk. I was wondering if is it possible to extend this method into 3 dimensions and to study eventually vortex rings?
Well, in principle, if you want, you ask something that I hide in some way. But in the case of Fermi superfluid, at the unitarity, the system is not such oblate. I mean, it's still oblate, but not like in the BC, because of physics related to the chemical potential and the interaction. So for sure, you can extract and you can extend in 3D. We already are, I mean, between the border between 2D and 3D. The only thing that is weird, in some way, we have always to say that the difference is 3D for the atoms or 3D for the vortex. Because as soon as what I'm saying to you is that we are almost always 2D for the vortex. Okay, because if the vortex start to be not like holes, but start to have lines, then of course you can use the same way, but the physics, okay, then must take into account the fact that the lines can in some way interconnect in the 3D system. So what I'm saying to you that what we studied here was 2D, more or less 2D, I would say, but quite a lot 2D for the vortex. But of course, if you want to have a 3D system with 3D vortex, then you can still use this, but then the description can be more complicated because there is tangling of lines.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Dalila, come.
Hey, Giacomo. So you
Hi.
talk about particles that live inside of, or quasi-particles that live inside of the vortex and bound states. So what's this? Is momentum state, is internal state, what is this?
Okay, so this is actually a very fundamental question. So what is happening is that the different nature of the superfluid with a finite gap that you have in the case of BCS, of course, affects how the vortex structure is. So it is expected, and the theory in fact sees this, that the vortex core is not dark. So if you want to leave the concept of bound state, that anyway is a description that mathematically is correct, but it's like if a quasi-particle can fill up the vortex also because the condensate fraction is not 1. So what I did not say you, and this was my mistake, is that even at t equals 0, a unitary Fermi superfluid, a unitary Fermi condensate or a BCS condensate has a condensate fraction that is not 1. Actually, in the unitary Fermi superfluid, that is the strongest Fermi superfluid that you can have in the sense of high critical velocity, the condensate fraction is 50%. It can be fully superfluid, but has 50% condensate fraction. That is also connected to this. So the rest of the particle can fill up. It's like, I mean, I see Monica and Patricia, both are in my screen. There was the idea to study sodium-potassium system in which you could create vortex on sodium and fill up the vortex of sodium core with potassium atoms. So I think that in some extent, this you have to think is what happens by definition there, because the condensate fraction is not 100%. So the vortex is gray, is not black.
Okay.
And that's it. I mean, of course, if you increase temperature or if you change the temperature, you expect this to change dramatically. And in fact, I thank you for the question. What we are planning to study, and it was not mentioned in the outline, is to take one vortex dipole, study the alpha coefficient versus temperature in BCS superfluid.
Okay, any other question? Before Vanderlei? No, so Vanderlei comes. I'm joking. No,
Hey, Giacomo, how are you?
Ciao, Vanderlei. Bene, tu?
You look very nice with this nice mask.
Yeah, I hope that I can come there without, so that is a hell. Anyway.
Thank you for the nice talk.
Thank you for the invitation.
I have a few questions.
Okay.
Well, the first is a comment only. If you are in 3D, dipole vortices are not very stable. So you cannot really sustain two filament of vortices making a dipole because they probably gonna tangle together or react or doing something strange. And then even though it seems very attractive to go for this type of collider in 3D, it doesn't seem like will take place.
Now, as soon as but you mean when the vortex become 3D?
Yeah. Now, what we know from Cooper pairs in superconductor is that when we create too much disturbance by putting impurities and everything, we somehow compromise the formation of the pairs, and then in many cases superconductivity becomes only at short range. My question to you is how the presence of vortices or many vortices producing sound waves and everything disturb the superfluidity of your fermionic system. If I keep putting vortices in there, do I keep the superfluidity forever? It seems very strange that will happen.
No, that will not work. So I mean, thank you for the question. So I give you an example, exactly what you say. If you take a superconductor and you start to put a magnetic field, you start to create vortices. Then if you increase the magnetic field, you add more vortices. But then there is a point in which the vortex distance become equal to the vortex distance become comparable with the Cooper pair size, and then the system become normal. So what I'm saying to you is that I would agree with you that if I start to sum up vortices and interaction between vortices, if I anyway exclude the temperature mechanism effect due to vortex decay, I expect that if the system become more than turbulent, then probably can become normal. Yeah. Would be nice to study for the different regimes.
Yeah, that's a peculiarity of fermionic systems. Huh? For a bosonic system,
that's what I'm saying. That in general, I would like to see what happens when the vortex density becomes linear vortex density becomes comparable with the size of the Cooper pair.
Okay. I have another question. We could not resist the temptation to see that the collision of the two vortices is like collisions that we learn in mechanical courses. So the pair comes and it seems to be going in some precise angles. My question is, what is conserved in those collisions of dipoles? Is the dipole value that's conserved is the momentum of the vortex? Because I can think about a negative mass for the vortex.
I mean, what we see is that for large enough value of vortex initial size, the dipole size is conserved. But then, of course, if the dipole size is not sufficiently large, then vortex dipole is not conserved, given the fact that we have different exit size with respect to initial. So we have a dissipation happening in the system.
So
that we address to be sound, or can be.
But it's very intriguing that it looks like billiard balls colliding, right? With the exchange of the part of the vortices.
I agree.
Okay, well, finally, Giacomo, what is really relevant on the collision of dipole vortices to understand other phenomena like, I already could catch from you that maybe we're going to understand a few things that like the extension of the dissipation, all that kind of thing, that's interesting. But what could we learn in colliding pair of vortices that will be fundamental for other processes that we know are relevant in superfluids or even in fermionic superfluids? Thank you.
Okay, I can start from to say what I think. I think that what is important in general is even the dynamics of a single vortex dipole, because as I was saying before to the previous lady, even one vortex dipole dynamics can tell you a lot, because since the size of the vortex dipole is related through some formula or some function to the energy of the vortex dipole, or to the momentum of the vortex dipole, then to see how this change in the propagation tells you if there are mechanisms of dissipation. And as I was saying to the previous lady, if I do the measurement versus temperature in the BCS superfluid or in the unitary superfluid, I can access the population of this Andre bound state. So I should see, in fact, how this scale with temperature. And then in principle, again, in a kind of measurement in which I measure this dissipation versus temperature, I can extrapolate to 0 temperature using in the data, and then I would have exactly the information about the under bound state that is directly related to the gap of the sphere superfluid. First. Second, I think that in general, as you know, I mean, to access quantum turbulence regime, there are many protocols that one can apply. One can be shaking methods, like, I mean, the one that you develop in São Carlos, can be some steering methods. But then the idea here, I would mostly say, is not the event of collision, but that we can add such event in a controllable way, scaling up, and to see how the sound and the vortex interaction can affect the system. So I think that was just, I mean, I don't know, maybe I am completely wrong, but maybe it was obvious that one vortex dipole or pairs of vortex dipole can annihilate producing sound. That is something that you expect because they are behaving like accelerated particle, but was never observed. So the issue here is what happens if I study 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 vortex dipole collision? Can I start to see how this system approach a regime of turbulence in which sound that we can in fact clearly measure in the system and vortex play a role in approaching this regime? So I would say the way in which I think that we have to see our work is not about the last part, it's about the concept. So the concept is to study vortex dynamic in a way in which people started to study also particle or superfluid dynamics or superfluid system, many-body system, but adding one particle in the system per time. So and I want to masturbate you and by philosophical, but the idea would be, if I treat now the vortex dipole or the vortex-like particle, I can add one vortex dipole by one in my system in a fully programmable way. And I can approach the regime, any regime, in a controllable fashion. That is something that I think is fundamental to study quantum turbulence in a controllable way.
Okay. Thank you, Giacomo. Vanderlei wants to complete a little.
Yeah.
Giacomo, there is a very interesting and challenging effect in 2D superfluid, which is this inverse cascade. And you are showing that if I have only a pair of the two dipoles, they probably never going to start to separate vortices and anti-vortices. If you started to disturb the collision with more, then you may start to understand why those guys want to cluster together vortices in one side and anti-vortices in the other.
Yeah,
I think this is a fundamental thing that having a collider like the one you have may help a lot to understand.
Well, I tell you, I cannot anticipate something that we are seeing now in the experiment. So I think that would be for the next time. But exactly the direction of studying clustering dynamics is what is accessible, clearly. I agree.
Thank you, Giacomo. There is another question that comes from WhatsApp. So it's Tobias Frederico, who was giving us also a lecture here in the school. He asked what to expect if there are more types of fermionic atoms, like 3 different ones, for example.
So the question is 3 different spin state?
Or atomic species, I don't know.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Okay, so start from the simple one. If there are 3 internal states of lithium, of course, any 2 couple is stable, and you can get superfluid. But as soon as I add the 3rd one, the system itself becomes unstable. So for lithium, is not a good idea. Meaning that I can use the 1-3, the 2-3, the 1-2 is fine, but the 1-2 plus 3 is not fine, or whatever other combination. So the question is actually, I never thought about that, but of course can be experiment like the one that is carried out by my friend Matteo here, close to me, is that in which you have lithium, for example, and chromium that are two fermionic atoms. And then, of course, what you can do, you can create with some trick, you can create a mass imbalance Fermi superfluid in which you have lithium and chromium forming the Cooper pair. That said, I do not have any answer. For sure, I mean, vortices you should expect to see. That's clear because the system is still condensed or superfluid. But I don't know if there is any effect or particular effect, but not because there is not, but because I never thought about that. So for sure, what is interesting, because I see Emmanuel there, would be nice to study, and this is actually a proposal that was given me by Luciano Reatto, that is a physician from Italy, but study a lot helium, is what happened when I study dipole-dipole collision or dipole propagation in dipolar superfluid. So this is another story. So I think that this would be an interesting experiment because vortices in general in this kind of system can give different topology and different geometry with respect to the S-wave scattering short range superfluid. Because of course there is the dipole-dipole interaction that can play a significant role in the dynamics. So this, for example, would be completely new stuff. I don't know if I answered the question, but.
I think it's fine. So thank you, Giacomo. Unfortunately, we are going to have to end. So thank you very much.
Ciao.
So we look forward to see you here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward also.
Yeah.
Ciao a tutti,
So,
grazie.
ciao.
Grazie dell'invito, buon pomeriggio.
So I will give to Vanderlei to chair the discussion. Yeah, it's the discussion now. I don't know. How you want.
We're going to discuss? Okay, we're going to discuss the relations of the school. No, it's a joke. Well, I think we have to take a photo. Yeah, before taking the photo, and since we have a few minutes, I would like just very fast to present to you our research laboratory on BEC and tell you opportunities, right? It's a school, and you are all young. Sometimes you're going to graduate somewhere and you're looking for possibilities. Or sometimes you know a friend that, oh, this is the topic I would like to be. So very fast I would like to present. I don't know if any member of the group has prepared anything, but I can show you what kind of thing we are involved. And because I think otherwise you're not going to know what we're doing, right? You saw in the lab, but I would like to show to you. Is that okay? And then we discuss generalities and celebration. And the school itself, because it would be nice to know your opinion. Eu tenho. Tá bom. Oh, this is a quotation of boy, this should not be here. But it is. This should not be here either. Okay, this is what should be here. Okay, well, very fast. We have a group in the laboratory. We have basically 3 condensates going on, and with the possibility of building up some more. And then I'm going to show to you what kind of thing we're doing, and maybe you are interested, and I'm going to ask the colleagues that work with us to give you some idea of what they are doing, so you get to know what our group is up to. Our group is very large. You know, it's a center inside the institute, and then we have different areas. You only know about the atomic physics, but we also involved in some other things that I'm not going to elaborate. In terms of Bose condensate, and it's not the full things on atomic physics, because we have also the laboratory of Philippe, together with Raul, that Raul presented yesterday. We have the laboratory of atomic clocks. You know, we're doing the fountain, we're doing the atomic clock based on thermal clouding expansion. And, well, at the present, the group looks like this. We have Emmanuel, that's here, Patricia, and me as faculties. And then we have Kilvia, Gustavo, and Monica as researchers. And then we have Lucas, Inácio, Amilson, and maybe somebody else, because we have a few positions for postdocs, either in theory or in experiment. And then we have a collection of graduate students. I hope I did not forget any. And they are all working in different aspects of the things we do. And undergraduate students. Here in Brazil, it's very common to take undergraduates as scientific initiation projects to see if that's the kind of thing. And I hope I did not forget any scientific initiation. Now, we have many collaborators, as you can see. And I am determined now to strengthen the cooperation with the international groups. So we are trying to make sure that we can carry on collaborative projects where our students can go and their students can come. And what we've been doing, you see, about 10 years ago, we started this turbulent stuff by introducing many dissipation, and we demonstrated, I think it's the first demonstration of turbulence in BC. If you don't believe that helium is a BC, but helium is also a BC, that's been going, I'm talking about atomic superfluids trapped that compose the BC. We made the many characterization. We studied the energy flow between scales. This has been measured. We developed a way of characterizing the evolution of the entropy, integral length scale, evidences of non-thermal fixed points during the evolution of the turbulence. And now what we're doing now, so in blue, quantification of the non-equilibrium, turbulence, BC in expansion, it's called speckle fields. We have done already some study before, because you may think, what we're going to use a turbulent cloud for? One of the things you can do is let expand, and that is a matter wave in propagation containing disorder, which is equivalent to the speckle in electromagnetic propagation, electromagnetic wave propagation, okay? What is the application of this? Well, this is like putting together the statistical of waves now in matter waves. That's what they do in speckles. We have many different experiments going on, and also the existence of universality, characterization of the non-equilibrium, quench now. 2D system, Patricia is working in preparing a 2D system to study many things, right? Maybe she is more appropriate to tell us about that. And Emmanuel is on the way to produce the dipolar condensate. On the top of that, we have other experiments, as Raul showed you yesterday, with non-condensates that may eventually, in the future, turn into condensate samples too. So this is basically what we do. We have in full operation, we used to have 3 BEC, 1 BEC we put in another room for Sergio to carry on, but I see that he's kind of walking through more the advancing of the theory of the BEC, but in principle, we have 3 BEC fully in operation. Just should to put the third one in operation back. And normally, we have the sodium, what we call the sodium-potassium mixture, which is also chance for many experiments. I did not put in the list the study of mixture of superfluid, and the idea is to, I don't know, I saw one of the posters yesterday about 2 species, and you actually may have transference of turbulence from one species to the other. This could create something that's only pertinent to the quantum world, which is controlling the turbulence. I turn on interaction and I remove vorticity from one superfluid, and everything goes to the second, and leave the first one quiet for a while, and then you can do that kind of thing. This is the sodium-potassium that Patricia, Kilvia is working hard on it, and probably we're going to have a 2D of sodium or potassium. I think it's more potassium, right, Patricia? Normally we excite in a very peculiar way. We shake, but it's not a shake like shaking a cup of coffee. It's a deforming and shaking tinily the potential. And many things happens there. And of course, one of the things we are doing is trying to figure out the evolution of the momentum distribution. And we observe many things in between, like the production of a giant vortex that decay in 4 tiny little kids, because that's the stable, and then they start to evolve in time. And Gustavo was responsible. And there is one point, I think in the last week we saw something about the formation of domains of condensate that may be a result of a severe disturbance. Then we call granulation. We already published a paper in collaboration with Andy Hewlett, because in 3D it's very hard to see granulation. So, you see, we are moving in the coming few years to a new building where we're supposed to have something like 8 laboratories in atomic physics, half of it in Bose condensation. And smart people like you guys are always very welcome. I'm now giving the microphone to the people of the group if they want to mention something. And then we come to thank you for your participation and everything. Mônica, você vai falar alguma coisa?
Patrícia?
Perde 1 minuto.
Hi, everyone. I'm here again. So I will just give you some ideas of what we are going to do in the near future. First, in the mixture experiment that has Kilvia, me, and Vanderlei as researchers for this experiment. And we have a lot of people working with us, as Emmanuel, that is leaving, so he's currently as a postdoc, but he's leaving soon. And then we have the other students. I think I put everyone. So the idea of the mixture, I'll talk very fast. We can talk later if you are interested. But the idea is we have sodium and potassium that interact among the atoms inside the clouds, like sodium interacts with sodium and potassium interacts with potassium. And if we put these 2 atomic clouds together, they will also interact against each other. And we can control this interaction by using Feshbach resonances. And if we cool down this mixture, we can produce two-species Bose-Einstein condensate with tunable interactions. So why this is interest? People use this kind of system to study many things. So people do molecules, study the physics of impurities with Bose and Fermi polarons. But here, what we want to do is we have basically two main research lines on the mixture. That is to study the miscible-immiscible phase transition and some exotic phase like quantum droplets, and also to study the dynamics of coupled vortices, even in a lattice configuration or reaching quantum turbulence in the two species BC. So for the first, we can study the miscible-immiscible phase transition as it occurs in classical fluids. It will also occur in quantum fluids, and then we have this transition being mediated by a miscibility parameter that I put there. So it's basically the competition between the intra and interspecies interaction strengths. And what have been seen, just for you to have an idea, in quantum fluids is something like this. So people here are changing the interspecies interaction between sodium and potassium, and they see that at the beginning they repel each other, and later they more or less overlap in space, going from an immiscible phase to a miscible phase. So, but then when we have a trapped system, trapped in a harmonic trap, it's not an homogeneous system, this miscibility parameter is not the full story. So we have to take also into account the trap geometry, the ratio between the atom number, to really establish where the miscible to immiscible phase transition happens. So we have a paper on it that just came up last year, so it's a theoretical paper, and we are going to study this transition in our system. And of course, we have other states of matter when we take into account the corrections to the mean field interactions that are exactly these quantum droplets. So here, these droplets are really like water droplets that are self-bounded. So here, what I'm showing on this image below is a cloud that is a quantum droplet, and this cloud is in free space. So it doesn't expand, it's really like a droplet. So this is quite nice. There are some experiments working with this, and we could also access this with our sodium-potassium mixture. And very briefly, Vanderlei showed to you a picture with vortices in the BC of sodium. So we also want to study the dynamics of coupled vortices. By coupled, I mean vortices in sodium and in potassium. And we want to do this across the miscible-immiscible phase transition, because then we'll have different behaviors. So these two columns here, more in the right of the screen, are the density profiles for each one of the different species, like one in the right, the other in the left. And here we are in the miscible regime, so they overlap in space, and I increase the velocity of rotation of this cloud when I go from up to below. So I see the nucleation of many, many vortices as I increase this velocity, and I can reach strange configurations for this lattice. So for example, instead of having a Birkhousov lattice that are triangular, I can have a square vortex lattice. And in the other case, where the system do not overlap, I have a vortex line that form these strange shapes. So this is the story for the mixture experiment. And I'm also starting an experiment with two-dimensional quantum gases. So for the moment, it's just me and Pedro that showed to you the poster on the DMD. But of course, Vanderlei and Kylvia will also join me on this future experiment, I believe. So the idea is that 2D gases, as Giacomo told you, are usually produced from three-dimensional clouds that are strong confined in one direction of space. This confinement can be done in many different ways. The usual way is using an optical lattice that can produce a very tight confinement in one direction, for example, the direction of gravity. So then if you reach a condition that the thermal energy of your cloud, Kb times T, is much smaller than the energy of the ground state of this optical lattice, you are in what we say a regime that your gas is kinematically 2D. So you are really in a 2D regime where all the dynamics occur in only 2 dimensions. So how do we do and how we will do this here? So we will use a lattice that is drawn here with these 2 green, where is the pointer? Here. So this is it's representing the lattice that will form an interference pattern here in the middle, where the atoms will be trapped. And then the 2D potential will be provided by a DMD, as Pedro showed to you in the poster section. And in principle, we can do any shape we want, as Giacomo also showed to you. The idea is just that we do the image we put on the DMD in the atomic plane. So we have very flexible geometries that we can produce. So these are absorption images of real atoms, so real 2D gases obtained during my postdoc at Jean Dalibard. So yeah, we can do anything in principle. So why this is interesting? Very, very briefly. So as Hélène Perrin also mentioned yesterday, in 2D, we have a different type of phase transition through which superfluidity occurs. Instead of having a Bose-Einstein condensate transition, we have what we call Berezinski-Kosterlik-Staules transition, or BKT transition. And this is a topological phase transition. I will not enter into the details, but the main idea is that 2D gases will have very different properties from 3D gases. So one of these properties is what we call the superfluid density jump. So when you have a 3D gas, the superfluid density, so the superfluid fraction or the BC fraction, will smoothly grow once you reach the critical temperature. So it will start at 0 and it will reach 1 at T equals 0. For a 2D gas, this is different. What we have is a jump here in the superfluid fraction, and this jump is universal for all systems that exhibit this kind of phase transition. So this is nice. This has been recently measured in ultra-cold atoms just last year, and there are still a lot of things to do on these systems. I will not super enter on the details here, just not to take too much time. But what we want to do here is also something that Giacomo just touched at the very end of his presentation, that is to study the superfluid properties of this system via the onset of quantum hydrodynamic instabilities. So hydrodynamic instabilities are well known in classical fluids. For example, this example of Kelvin-Helmholtz instability and this of Rayleigh-Taylor instability, and we are going to pursue the observation of such quantum analogs in a 2D superfluid. Okay, so that's it. Sorry, I was too long.
Thank you, Patricia. Now Lucas will talk a little bit. Okay. Just a minute to turn on the microphone of our speaker.
Será que não é melhor usar? Oh. Can you hear me? Yeah, good. So, I'm going to present to you the atomic physics theory group here at CEPOF. Vanderlei talked a little bit about CEPOF, but CEPOF is the acronym in Portuguese for Optics and Photonics Research Center. So if you want to check out the members, the publications, the areas, the research areas, please refer to this website here. And I took this screenshot today, or this week, and of course the school is it's taking much of the web page. Also, if you want to keep up with our seminars, our lectures, classes, there's a YouTube channel with lots of videos that go from Physics 101 up to Nobel lectures, Nobel laureate lectures. So the theory group is comprised of Monica. Monica is has a permanent position here. Inácio and I are postdocs. And we have several students ranging from undergraduate to PhD. Guilherme was chair in one of the sessions. He's Monica's PhD student. Salvio, is Salvio here? No, but probably you interacted with him during the school. We have Ats, who is doing simulations too. And I have 2 undergraduate students that are working not related to the experiments, but with strongly interact systems. And I didn't list here, but being in the theory group, we also interact with lots of students that are working in the experiments. So Arnaud, Michele, Leandro, and probably many more that I'm forgetting right now. And in the theory group, we are interested, of course, in the experiment, and that would be quantum turbulence. But we also have our own research interests in atomic physics. Mine is related to strongly interacting atomic systems and also how to connect these with other fields, mainly nuclear physics. So you heard a lot about this during this week from Tobias, Lauro, Bira van Kalk. So also you heard a lot this week about quantum turbulence, so I'm not going to repeat all of that. I'm just going to say that when we are dealing with trapped Bose-Einstein condensates, there are some difficulties in identifying and characterizing turbulence in these systems due to the finite size, the fact that they're in a harmonic trap, and also how we probe this turbulent cloud, and questions to what kind of turbulence we see in these systems. A very standard and common way of seeing turbulence in these systems are the so-called energy and particle cascades, so this self-similar transfer of energy and particles. And here the São Carlos group was a pioneer in observing quantum turbulence in trapped BCs. That was back in 2009. So if I would put in broad words, I would say the objective with this is to find alternative ways to identify and characterize quantum turbulence in these systems. So when I first, a little bit about the experimental procedure. So we start with a condensate in equilibrium, and then besides the coils for trapping the condensate, we have this pair of excitation coils that are slightly tilted with respect to the trapping coils, meaning that if we put a current in them, they're actually producing a magnetic field that's slightly off-axis with respect to the BC. And this generates distortions, rotations, and then excites this BC. And we can vary the amplitude of this excitation, how long we do it, its frequency, and then we can drive this BC from equilibrium to an out of equilibrium state, for example, a turbulent BC. What's the main ingredient? What can we get from the experiment is the momentum distribution. So we know how many particles essentially are in certain momentum ranges. So this is the observable that we have to, so that we can do work, can use from the theoretical point of view. And I think Nicolas asked this question either to Arnaud or Michel, which was, can we identify a power law in this momentum distribution? And it's pretty hard because we don't have lots of length scales, and this limits the range that we have to see this power law behavior. So that's when this comes in of, this quest for finding alternative ways to identify and classify turbulence in these systems. So one of the first things that I did when I came here was an approach based on energy fluxes. So the idea being, when you have this turbulent state, you have a region, the so-called inertial region, where there's no energy accumulation. And so the energy flows without being accumulated in this region. And this, as you can see on the graph here on the left, it's much easier to identify than to trying to look for a power law in this other graph. We also had this idea to identify turbulence in these systems by looking at the entropy, because turbulence is associated with disorder. And what better quantity to look at than entropy for disorder? But we do have an experimental limitation to use the textbook entropy equations, which is, in experiments we have access only to the amplitude of the wave function, psi square. We don't have the phase of the wave function, as people that do simulations have access. So what we did was, Ed Nilsson, one of our collaborators, derived an expression for the entropy with the constraints of our experiment. That is, we only know the momentum distribution, the amplitude of the wave function. And with this expression for the entropy consistent with what we see in the experiment, we were able to compute this quantity and use it to identify when we produce a turbulent cloud. So this was another, in my opinion, neat way of identifying turbulence in the systems. If you saw Michelle's poster, she talked about this characteristic length scale, which we also used as a way to identify turbulence in these systems. Related to Thomas Gazenzer talk, so he talked about this class of systems that you produce an out of equilibrium state and you let it evolve towards equilibrium. And for some systems, they can pass through what's called a non-thermal fixed point, in the vicinity of a non-thermal fixed point. And the consequence for this is that you can produce a universal scaling that's characterized by just a couple of exponents, this alpha and beta here. Meaning that we have some momentum distributions here on the left, and then because this system, as it evolves towards equilibrium, passes near this non-thermal fixed points, when we scale the momentum distributions according to this, they collapse onto a single universal function. So this has been an ongoing area of research here. If you are interested in quantum turbulence, I'll leave here 2 references for you to check it out. This one here, it's a very long, detailed reference, so you'll find lots and lots of details. This second one is more like a bird's eye view, so that depends on what you're looking for. And as I said, I'm also interested in strongly interactive systems. We heard a lot about them these past weeks. Teresa Paiva talked about the BEC-BCS crossover, so did Renato and Giacomo. Tobias, Lauro, and Bira Van Kolk, they also talked about this. So the idea is, these are, for example, 2-component Fermi gases, And then we, as Giacomo said, we can observe the BC-BCS crossover that goes from huge pairs on the BCS limit, going through unitarity up to the BEC limit where we have these tightly bound pairs of fermions. They don't have to be fermions. We can also look at the strongly interacting systems looking at bosons with large scattering lengths. We learned a lot about FMOV physics in this school. And the methods that I use for this are the quantum Monte Carlo methods. So Renato talked about this in detail, variation and diffusion in Monte Carlo. Again, I don't have much time, but I'm going to leave some references here if you're interested. Vanderlei and I, we wrote this review where we make a parallel between cold atoms and nuclear physics. So if you're interested in this interface, this is a nice place to start. If you want to see that actually in practice, I'll leave this reference here where we compare vortices. That, again, something we heard a lot in this school, both in low density neutron matter and cold Fermi gases. And we find that if the density of the neutron matter is low enough, we can compare them. So in principle, we could produce vortices here in labs on Earth and compare to things that we see in neutron stars, and things like that. And if you liked FMOV physics, you can also check out this paper that I wrote with Tobias, Lauro, and collaborators, that we look at these properties of bosons when the scattering length is large. So I think that's it. Thank you for your time.
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'll not talk a lot about the physics since I had the opportunity to explain to you a little about the physics yesterday. So I'll just recall quickly that we have two experiments here with strontium. And in the first experiment, so I'm showing here, I have not shown lots of experimental details yesterday because I focused on the ideas, but I show here an image of our small cloud that we are still trying to densify a little more. So we have already the cloud. We are close to getting the first results on the transmission of light through the cloud through the dense cloud. So as I said yesterday, we want to study, our short-term goal here is to study light scattering in the dense regime, which is a problem connected to saturation of the index of refraction and also connected to Anderson localization of light, or the absence of 3D Anderson localization of light. Okay? So here is our cloud. Here are some predictions that we have done in our laboratory that we will compare to our results, experimental results, once we have them. So these are transmission spectra of this dense cloud. So the medium to long-term goal in this experiment is to go to an optical lattice in order to study superradiance and subradiance in these optical lattice. So there are recent predictions that shows that we can have good control on the superradiant and subradiant behavior, and we could implement, for example, quantum memories using this kind of systems. Okay, so this is the medium-term goal of this experiment. On the other hand, we have the Strontium 2 experiment. I have not shown neither experimental details, but this is a picture of the ring cavity, so you can see the three mirrors here because they are illuminated by blue light. Here you have the small strontium MOT, and actually this is a MOT created on the broad transition, but Stromstrom 2 experiment has already the MOT on the narrow transition. This means that the MOT is already cold, like it has 1 microkelvin. So they are really close to getting their first results on the gravity measurement, as I said yesterday. So the first goal is to measure gravity through a non-destructive measurement because of the interaction between the atoms and the light on the cavity. So they will be able to monitor the light coming out of the cavity and see and measure the oscillation frequency, so measure gravity, okay? And the long-term goal of this experiment is to enjoy the fact that you have a ring cavity and atoms inside to study squeezing of momentum state of these atoms, for example. This is one of the long-term goals. So for that, we will still need to implement Bragg beams on this system in order to make a momentum transfer of these atoms from, put the atoms into a momentum superposition state of momenta, different momenta, and then squeeze the state through the interaction with the modes of the cavity. So this is long-term goal. So I showed yesterday the team, so I show here again. So just Claudio is not in the picture. But you have must met him because he was here at the school. And of course, if you are interested in what we're doing, you can reach us, and we will be glad to explain more and to discuss positions. We always have open positions, almost always. Now we have. Okay. So thank you for your attention.
Hi, everybody. We have a last presentation. I will try to be very quickly. Lucas already explained a little bit about the group, the part of the work that your group are doing, the part of the theory, and the relation that you have with the experiments. Then this is the team. And I just want to say some words about some of the other works that I'm involved with some of the students. For example, this one was presented by Salvo yesterday. It relates to the dynamics of the vortex in a curved superfluids. That is basically when you have these bubble traps that you produce uniform distribution of atoms trapped in a surface. Of course, this is an ideal situation. The experimentals is not to reach there because you have, for example, Hélène Perrin shows that they have the gravity, then this not make possible you have these uniform superfluid films. That this is just ideal model for a while. But otherwise, you have some experiments in the spatial laboratories that you show how to prevent the gravity, and then you start to have this more this uniformness, density distribution. More probably you reach this in some years. Okay, then Salvo will make this first derivation of how the dynamics of dipoles behaves in these surface films. And it's important that in this closed surface, you have always have this pair of vortex appear in the system. And we also have the collaboration with Professor Fetter and Pietro Massingan. They are helping us to evolve from the sphere for another surface, like spheroids, that's characterized better the experiments. Hélène Perrin shows that you have ellipsoids surface, isomagnetic surface to trap the atoms instead of spheres, because of the properties of the magnetic traps. This is part of the works that you are doing. Also, you have related to the bubble traps. When you have the gravity, Hélène Perrin shows that you have these ring structures, and you also try to simulate the kind of vortex structure that you obtain in the system. And when you have this bubble trap, plus gravity and rotation. Then you produce many configurations of the vortexes from lattices with a uniform vorticity distributed along all the sample, from this regime to macro vortex. That's the giant vortex that Hélène mentioned in her presentations too. And then you try to study here the signatures of these configurations of vortex, not only due to the density profile that you see these dips that correspond to the vortex, but also seeing how this configuration will change the collective modes frequencies. This is an ongoing project. This is my student Guilherme. And just to be quickly, I just mentioned another project that's related to the mixtures, the experiment that Patricia explains. Then you try to study how you have this effective interaction between two species. In this case, it's Bose-Fermi mixtures, but you also can use two Bose species. And we have some experiments, some theoretical models that we developed when I was doing a postdoc in Utrecht with Professor Christian Moraes. Is our collaborations too. And from that experiment, we evolved from the studies of mixtures with different dimensionalities, and also the study of polarons. I think Renato made an overview about these polaron quasi-particles in a background, in a BC background in this case. Well, this is the work that you are doing now. I also try to evolve from this model to have another one that that you allow me to collaborate with Lucas Madeira when you start to see the possible pairing that you have from going from BCS from BEC regime. It's another ongoing project that we intend to do in the future. Okay, this is all that I have to present today. Sorry for taking too much time. And if you have any questions, you are open to discuss. Thank you very much. Where is Vanderlei? Okay, now I give the word for Vanderlei.
Well, you see, you have an idea. You always welcome here in São Carlos, independently if you want to work with us or not. Just anything you need from us, no matter where you are, just contact us, and we'll be here trying to help you. Well, I'm going to call the people that were behind the meeting, right, the school, so we can thank you. Okay, Thalita, Monica, Lucas. You see, even though we have not a very large number of people presently, we have another number outside. It is necessary, a lot of work behind, right? Any moment we need something to be done. I'm looking for Wanda, the lady that takes care of the coffee. That's very important. I did not find her. But we have Chitão. Chitão takes care of connecting with the YouTube, making the editions, putting the videos. So let's take him. And we have Brás, which is in the studio. We have a TV studio for the group that we broadcast lectures, everything. So he's there now working, and I wish he was here. But we also thank you, Brás, even though he's not here. Michael is the home man, is the man that takes care, makes sure that everything is working here in the auditorium, and is making all the connections, microphone, audiovisual, and everything. So Michael is the guy that makes sure that we can be here. So we thank you very much. Talita. Talita, you know, she's doing trapping of tiny little objects, but those days she was helping to trap you here and make sure that all the connection with the speakers outside or the students or organizing the posters, organizing the all the transmission, part of the homepage or most of the homepage. So Talita is being a very important lady for us those days. So let's thank Talita. Oh, that's Brás. And we like the T-shirt of Brás because represent very well. You know the guy? What is the Mexicans? Yeah, that's Chapulín Colorado. And that's very Brás. And we have Monica and Lucas that actually really made all the connection, organized really everything. So we all help somehow, but me, Patricia, and the other guys of the group, but Lucas and Monica that really took the hard work of making all the connections, send the letters, make sure that we could be here in a presential meeting, even though only officially the university is open to receiving people 2 weeks from now. But we were able, you know, we made all the stuff. This is auditorium for more than 200 people, so we put about 50, 60, so that's perfectly okay. We didn't have any problem during the school, and that's because this team organized very well. So thank you very much, Monica, Lucas, and everybody. You know, I was going to give a flower to Monica and to Talita, and something else to Brás, to Chitão, to Michael, to Lucas, but they said, no, we prefer a car and a trip to somewhere. So they're going to get what they deserve. They're going to get probably a prize for going somewhere. And so thank you very much. And we thank you. You know, it's a school. They're not supposed to be a workshop, right? So we try to convince the speakers that they should tell us about modern research, but in a pedagogical way, because the whole idea is to expose people that are starting their career, and I hope that with this school, we motivate you more than introduce demotivation for you. So I hope that you are more decided now than 2 weeks ago that this is a nice field to work with, and we all believe it is. And that was the purpose of the school. The school could not happen without the participants. And then we all thank you very much for coming. We now are going to lunch, and tonight we're going for the pizza. Will be a more relaxing pizza because it's the last dinner you have with us. And then tomorrow is the departure. Some of you are going to leave today, and most of you are going to leave tomorrow. So thank you very much for everything. If you like São Carlos and the organization, you tell your friends. If you don't like, just keep for you. Okay? Everybody, let's go for lunch, and we consider the school done. And now we're going to take a picture all together here. Let's go up, up, up. Oh, wait. So when Wanda comes, we all say, Wanda, Wanda. Wanda, Wanda, Wanda. Without Wanda, no coffee. Okay, guys, thank you very much. Let's go. Today is another Virado Paulista, which is a good plate. So let's go. Huh? Oh, if you want to take a picture with everybody, let's come up. We have a nice picture with everybody, this time going up. Cadê o Sebastião?